The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 19. Of course the Sterlings had not left the poor maniac alone all this time or refrained from heroic efforts to rescue her perishing soul and reputation. Uncle James's lawyer had helped him as little as his doctor, came one day, and finding Valancy alone in the kitchen as he supposed, gave her a terrible talking to, told her she was breaking her mother's heart and disgracing her family. "But why?" said Valancy, not ceasing to score her porridge pot decently. "I'm doing honest work for honest pay. What is there in it that is disgraceful?" "Don't quibble, Valancy," said Uncle James solemnly. "This is no fit place for you to be, and you know it. Why, I'm told that your jailbird Snaith is hanging around here every evening." "Not every evening," said Valancy reflectively. "No, not quite every evening." It's insufferable," said Uncle James violently. "Valancy, you must come home. We won't judge you harshly. I assure you we won't. We will overlook all this." "Thank you," Valancy said. "Have you no sense of shame?" demanded Uncle James. "Oh, yes, but the things I am ashamed are not the things you are ashamed of." Valancy proceeded to rinse her dishcloth meticulously. Still, Uncle James was patient. He gripped the sides of his chair and ground his teeth. "We know your mind isn't just right. We'll make allowances, but you must come home. You shall not stay here with that drunken, blasphemous old scoundrel." "Were you by chance referring to me, Mr. Sterling?" demanded Roaring Abel, suddenly appearing in the doorway of the veranda where he had been smoking a peaceful pipe and listening to old Jim Sterling's tirade with huge enjoyment. His red beard fairly bristled with indignation and his huge eyebrows quivered, but cowardice was not among James Sterling's shortcomings. "I was, and furthermore I want to tell you that you have acted an iniquitous part in luring this weak and unfortunate girl away from her home and friends. I will have you punished yet for it." James Sterling got no further. Roaring Abel crossed the kitchen at a bound, caught him by the collar in his trousers, and hurled him through the doorway and over the garden paling with as little apparent effort as he might have employed in whisking away a troublesome kitten out of the way. "The next time you come back here," he bellowed, "I'll throw you through the window, and all the better if the window is shut. Coming here thinking yourself got to put the worlds to rights." Valancy candidly and unashamedly owned to herself that she had seen a few more satisfying sights than Uncle James's coattails flying out of the asparagus bed. She had once been afraid of this man's judgment. Now she saw clearly he was nothing but a rather stupid little village tin god. Roaring Abel turned with his great broad laugh. "He'll think of that for years when he wakes up in the night. The Almighty made a mistake in making so many Sterlings, but since they are made, we've got to reckon with them. Too many to kill out. But if they come here bothering you, I'll shoo 'em off before a cat could lick its ear." The next time they sent Dr. Stalling, surely Roaring Abel would not throw him into the asparagus bed. Dr. Stalling was not so sure of this and had no great liking for the task. He did not believe Valancy Sterling was out of her mind. She had always been queer. She was only just a little queerer than usual. Dr. Stalling had his own reasons for disliking Roaring Abel. When Dr. Stalling had first come to Deerwood, he had a liking for long hikes around Misswautus and Muskokowa. On one of those occasions he had got lost, and after much wandering had fallen into Roaring Abel with his gun over his shoulder. Dr. Stalling had contrived to ask his question about the most idiotic manner possible. He said, "Can you tell me where I'm going?" "How the devil should I know where you're going, Gosling?" retorted Abel contemptuously. Dr. Stalling was so enraged that he could not speak for a moment or two, and in that moment Abel had disappeared in the woods. Dr. Stalling had eventually found his way home, but he had never hankered to encounter Abel Gay again. Nevertheless, he now came to do his duty. Valancy greeted him with a sinking heart. She had to own herself that she was terribly afraid of Dr. Stalling still. She had a miserable conviction that if he shook his long, bony finger at her and told her to go home, she dared not disobey. "Mr. Gay," said Dr. Stalling politely and condescendingly, "may I see Miss Sterling alone for a few minutes?" Roaring Abel was a little drunk, just drunk enough to be excessively polite and very cunning. He had been on the point of going away when Dr. Stalling arrived, but now he sat in the corner of the parlor and folded his arms. "No, no, mister," he said solemnly, "that wouldn't do at all. I've got the reputation of my household to keep up. I've got to chaperone this long lady. Can't have any sparking going on here behind my back." outraged Dr. Stalling looked so terrible that Valancy wondered how Abel could endure this aspect. But Abel was not worried at all. "I know nothing about it anyway," he asked genially. "About what?" "Sparking," said Abel coolly. Poor Dr. Stalling, who had never been married because he believed in a celibate clergy, would not notice this ribald remark. He turned his back on Abel and addressed himself to Valancy. "Miss Sterling, I am here in response to your mother's wishes. She begged me to come. I am charged with some messages from her. Will you," he wagged his finger, "will you hear them?" "Yes," said Valancy faintly, eyeing the forefinger. It had been a hypnotic effect on her. "This first is this. If you will leave this house," interjected Rowing Abel. "House. Troubled with impediment your speech, ain't you, mister? This place, and return to your home. Mr. James Starling will himself pay a good nurse to come here and wait on Miss Gay." Back of her chair, Valancy smiled in secret. Uncle James must indeed regard the matter as desperate when he would loosen his purse strings like that. At any rate, her clans no longer despised her or ignored her. She had become important to them. "That's my business, mister," said Abel. "Miss Sterling can go if she pleases or stay if she pleases. I made a fair bargain with her, and she's free to conclude it when she likes. She gives me my meals that stick to my ribs. She don't forget to put salt in the porridge. She never slams doors, and when she has nothing to say, she don't talk. That's uncanny in a woman, you know, mister. I'm satisfied. If she isn't, she's free to go. But no woman comes in here in James Sterling's pay. If anyone does," Abel's voice was uncannily bland and polite, "I'll splatter the road with her brains. Tell him that A. Gay's compliments." "Dr. Stalling, a nurse is not what Sissy needs," said Valancy earnestly. "She isn't so ill as that yet. What she wants is companionship, somebody she knows and likes just to live with her. You can understand that, I'm sure." "I understand that your motive is quite commendable." Dr. Stalling felt that he was broad-minded indeed, especially as his secret soul he did not believe Valancy's motive was commendable. He had the least idea what she was up to, but he was sure her motive was not commendable. When he could not understand a thing, he straightway condemned it, simplicity itself. "But your first duty is to your mother. She needs you. She implores you to come home. She will forgive everything if you only come home." "That's a pretty little thought," remarked Abel meditatively, as he ground some tobacco up in his hand. Dr. Stalling ignored him. "She entreats, but Miss Sterling," Dr. Stalling remembered that he was an ambassador of Jehovah, "I command, as your pastor and spiritual guide, I command you to come home with me this very day. Get your hat and coat and come now." Dr. Stalling shook his finger at Valancy. Before that pitiless finger she drooped and wilted visibly. "She's giving in," thought Rowing Abel. "She'll go with him. Beats all the power these preachers fellows have over women." Valancy was on the point of obeying Dr. Stalling. She must go home with him and give up. She would last back to Dos Sterling again, and for her few remaining days or weeks be the cowed, futile creature that she had always been. It was her fate, typified with the relentless uplifted forefinger. She could no longer escape from it than Rowing Abel from his predestination. She eyed it as fascinated bird eyes the snake. Another moment. "Fear is the original sin," suddenly said a small voice back of Valancy's consciousness. "Almost all the evil in the world has its origin in the fact that someone is afraid of something." Valancy stood up. She was still in the clutches of fear, but her soul was her own again. She would not be false to that inner voice. "Dr. Stalling," she said slowly, "I do not at present owe any duty to my mother. She is quite well. She has all the assistance and companionship she requires. She does not need me at all. I am needed here. I'm going to stay here." "There's spunk for you," said Rowing Abel admiringly. Dr. Stalling dropped his forefinger. One could have not keep on shaking a finger forever. "Miss Sterling, is there nothing that can influence you? Do you remember your childhood days?" "Perfectly, and I hate them." "Do you realize what people will say, what they are saying?" "I can imagine it," said Valancy with a shrug of her shoulders. She was suddenly free of fear again. "I haven't listened to the gossip of Deerwood tea parties and sewing circles 20 years for nothing. But Dr. Stalling, it doesn't matter in the least to me what they say. Not in the least. Dr. Stalling went away, a girl who cared nothing for public opinion, over whom sacred family ties had no restraining influence, who hated her childhood memories. Then Cousin Georgiana came, on her own initiative, for nobody would have thought it would be worthwhile to send her. She found Valancy alone, weeding the little vegetable garden she had planted, and made all the platitudious pleas she could think of. Valancy heard her patiently. Cousin Georgiana wasn't such a bad soul after all. Then she said, "And now that you have got all that out of your system, Cousin Georgiana, can you tell me how to make creamed codfish so that it will not be as thick as porridge and as salt as the Dead Sea?" "We'll just have to wait," said Uncle Benjamin. "After all, Sissy Gate can't live long. Dr. Marsh tells me she may drop off any day." Mrs. Frederick wept. It would really have been so much easier to bear if Valancy had died. She could have worn mourning then. End of chapter 19.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. When Abel Gay paid Valancy her first month's wages, which she did promptly in bills reeking with the odor of tobacco and whiskey, Valancy went into Deerwood and spent every cent of it. She got a pretty green crepe dress with a girdle of crimson beads, at a bargain sale, a pair of silk stockings to match, and a little crinkled green hat with a crimson rose in it. She even bought a foolish little beribboned and belaced nightgown. She passed the house on Elm Street twice. Valancy never even thought about it as home, but saw no one. No doubt her mother was sitting in the room this lovely June evening, playing solitaire and cheating. Valancy knew that Mrs. Frederick always cheated. She never lost a game. Most of the people Valancy met looked at her seriously and passed her with a cool nod. Nobody stopped to speak to her. Valancy put on her green dress when she got home. Then she took it off again. She felt so miserably undressed in its low neck and short sleeves, and that low, crimson girdle around the hips seemed positively indecent. She hung it up in the closet, feeling flatly that she had wasted her money. She would never have the courage to wear that dress. John Foster's arraignment of fear had no power to stiffen her against this. In this one thing, habit and custom were still all-powerful. Yet she sighed as she went down to meet Barney Snaith in her old snuff-brown silk. That green thing had been very becoming. She had seen so much in her one ashamed glance. Above it, her eyes had looked like odd brown jewels, and the girdle had given her flat figure an entirely different appearance. She wished she could have left it on. But there were some things John Foster did not know. Every Sunday evening Valancy went to the little Free Methodist church in a valley on the edge of Up Back, a spireless little gray building among the pines, with a few sunken graves and mossy gravestones in the small, paling-encircled, grass-grown square beside it. She liked the minister who preached there. He was so simple and sincere. An old man, who lived in Port Lawrence and came out by the lake in a little disappearing propeller boat to give free service to the people of the small, stony farms back of the hills, who would otherwise never have heard any gospel message. She liked the simple service and the fervent singing. She liked to sit by the open window and look out into the pine woods. The congregation was always small. The Free Methodists were few in number, poor, and generally illiterate. But Valancy loved those Sunday evenings. For the first time in her life she liked going to church. The rumor reached Deerwood that she had turned Free Methodist and sent Mrs. Frederick to bed for a day. But Valancy had not turned anything. She went to the church because she liked it, and because, in some inexplicable way, it did her good. Old Mr. Towers believed exactly what he preached, and somehow it made a tremendous difference. Oddly enough, Roaring Abel disapproved of her going to the Hill Church as strongly as Mrs. Frederick herself could have done. He had no use for Free Methodists. He was a Presbyterian. but Valency went in spite of him. "We'll hear something worse than that about her soon," Uncle Benjamin predicted gloomily. They did. Valency could not quite explain, even to herself, just why she wanted to go to that party. It was a dance "up back" at Chidley Corners, and dances at Chidley Corners were not, as a rule, the sort of assemblies where well-brought-up young ladies were found. Valency knew it was coming off, for Roaring Abel had been engaged as one of the fiddlers. But the idea of going had never occurred to her until Roaring Abel himself broached it at supper. "You come with me to the dance," he ordered. "It'll do you good, put some color in your face. You look peaked. You want something to liven you up." Valency found herself suddenly wanting to go. She knew nothing at all of what dances at Chidley Corners were apt to be like. Her idea of dances had been fashioned on the corrective fairs that went by that name in Deerwood and Port Lawrence. Of course she knew the Corners dances wouldn't be just like them. Much more informal, of course, but so much the more interesting. Why shouldn't she go? Sissy was in a week of apparent health and improvement. She wouldn't mind staying alone in the least. She entreated Valency to go if she wanted to, and Valency did want to go. She went to her room to dress. A rage against the snuff-brown silk seized her. Wear that to a party? Never! She pulled a green crepe from its hanger and put it on feverishly. It was nonsense to feel so naked, just because her neck and arms were bare. That was just her old maidishness. She would not be ridden by it. On went the dress, the slippers. It was the first time she had worn a pretty dress since the organdies of her early teens, and they had never made her look like this. If only she had a necklace or something, she wouldn't feel so bare then. She ran down to the garden. There were clovers there, great crimson things growing in the long grass. Valency gathered handfuls of them and strung them on a cord. Fastened above her neck, they gave her the comfortable sensation of a collar and were oddly becoming. Another circlet of them went round her hair, dressed in the low puffs that became her. Excitement brought those faint pink stains to her face. She flung on her coat and pulled the little twisty hat over her hair. "You look so nice and different, dear," said Sissy. "Like a green moonbeam with a gleam of red in it, if there could be such a thing." Valency stooped to kiss her. "I don't feel right about leaving you alone, Sissy." "Oh, I'll be all right. I feel better tonight than I have for a long while. I've been feeling badly to see you sticking here so closely on my account. I hope you have a nice time. I never was at a party at the Corners, but I used to go sometimes, long ago, to dances up back. We always had good times. And you needn't be afraid of father being drunk tonight. He never drinks when he engages to play for a party. But there may be liquor. What will you do if it gets rough?" "Nobody would molest me." "Not seriously, I suppose. Father would see to that. But it might be noisy and unpleasant." "I won't mind. I'm only going as a looker on. I don't expect to dance. I just want to see what a party up back is like. I've never seen anything except decorous Deerwood." Sissy smiled rather dubiously. She knew much better than Valency what a party "up back" might be like if there should be liquor. But again, there mightn't be. "I hope you'll enjoy it," she repeated. Valency enjoyed the drive there. They went early, for it was 12 miles to Chidley Corners, and they had to go in Abel's old, ragged top buggy. The road was rough and rocky, like most Muskoka roads, but full of the austere charm of northern woods. It wound through beautiful, purring pines that were ranks of enchantment in the June sunset, and over the curious jade-green rivers of Muskoka, fringed by aspens that were always quivering with some supernal joy. Roaring Abel was excellent company, too. He knew all the stories and legends of the wild, beautiful "up back" and he told them to Valancy as they drove along. Valancy had several fits of inward laughter over what Uncle Benjamin and Aunt Wellington et al. Would feel and think and say if they saw her driving with Roaring Abel in that terrible buggy to a dance at Chidley Corners. At first the dance was quiet enough, and Valancy was amused and entertained. She even danced twice herself with a couple of nice, up-back boys who danced beautifully and told her she did too. Another compliment came her way, not a very subtle one, perhaps, but Valancy had had too few compliments in her life to be over-nice on that point. She overheard two of the up-back young men talking about her in the dark lean-to behind her. "Know who that girl in green is?" "Nope. Guess she's from out front. The port, maybe. Got a stylish look to her." "No beaut, but cute lookin', I'll say. J'ever see such eyes?" The big room was decorated with pine and fir boughs, and lighted by Chinese lanterns. The floor was waxed, and Roaring Abel's fiddle, purring under his skilled touch, worked magic. The up-back girls were pretty and prettily dressed. Valancy thought it the nicest party she had ever attended. By 11 o'clock she had changed her mind. A new crowd had arrived, a crowd unmistakably drunk. Whisky began to circulate freely. Very soon almost all the men were partly drunk. Those in the porch and outside around the door began howling, "Come all yees," and continued to howl them. The room grew noisy and reeking. Quarrels started up here and there. Bad language and obscene songs were heard. The girls, swung rudely in the dances, became disheveled and tawdry. Valancy, alone in her corner, was feeling disgusted and repentant. Why had she ever come to such a place? Freedom and independence were all very well, but one should not be a little fool. She might have known what it would be like. She might have taken warning from Sissy's guarded sentences. Her head was aching. She was sick of the whole thing. But what could she do? She must stay to the end. Abel could not leave till then, and that would probably not be until 3 or 4 in the morning. The new influx of boys had left the girls far in the minority, and partners were scarce. Valancy was pestered with invitations to dance. She refused them all shortly, and some of her refusals were not well taken. There were muttered oaths and sullen looks. Across the room she saw a group of the strangers talking together and glancing meaningly at her. What were they plotting? It was at this moment that she saw Barney Snaith looking in over the heads of the crowds at the doorway. Valancy had two distinct convictions. One was that she was quite safe now. The other was that this was why she had wanted to come to the dance. It had been such an absurd hope that she had not recognized it before, but now she knew that she had come because of the possibility that Barney might be there, too. She thought that perhaps she ought to be ashamed for this, but she wasn't. After her feelings of relief, her next feeling was one of annoyance with Barney for coming there unshaved. Surely he might have enough self-respect to groom himself up decently when he went to a party. There he was, bareheaded, bristly-chinned, in his old trousers and his blue homespun shirt. Not even a coat. Valancy could have shaken him in her anger. No wonder people believed everything bad of him. But she was not afraid any longer. One of the whispering group left his comrades and came across the room to her, through the whirling couples that now filled it uncomfortably. He was a tall, broad-shouldered fellow, not ill-dressed or ill-looking, but unmistakably half-drunk. He asked Valancy to dance. Valancy declined civilly. His face turned livid. He threw his arm about her and pulled her to him. His hot, whiskied breath burned her face. "We won't have fine lady airs here, my girl. If you ain't too good to come here, you ain't too good to dance with us. Me and my pals have been watching you. You've got to give us each a turn and a kiss to boot." Valancy tried desperately and vainly to free herself. She was being dragged out into the maze of shouting, stamping, yelling dancers. The next moment the man who held her went staggering across the room from a neatly planted blow on the jaw, knocking down whirling couples as he went. Valancy felt her arm grasped. "This way! Quick!" said Barney Snaith. He swung her out through the open window behind him, vaulted lightly over the sill, and caught her hand. "Quick! We must run for it. They'll be after us." Valancy ran as she had never run before, clinging tight to Barney's hand, wondering why she did not drop dead in such a mad scamper. Suppose she did! What a scandal it would make for her poor people. For the first time, Valancy felt a little sorry for them. Also, she felt glad that she had escaped from that horrible row. Also, glad that she was holding tight to Barney's hand. Her feelings were badly mixed, and she had never had so many in such a brief time in her life. They finally reached a quiet corner in the pine woods. The pursuit had taken a different direction, and the whoops and yells behind them were growing faint. Valancy, out of breath, with a crazily beating heart, collapsed on the trunk of a fallen pine. "Thanks!" she gasped. "What a goose you were to come to such a place!" said Barney. "I didn't know it would be like this," protested Valancy. "You should have known. Chitley Corners! It was just a name to me." Valancy knew Barney could not realize how ignorant she was of the regions up back. She had lived in Deerwood all her life, and of course he supposed she knew. He didn't know how she had been brought up. There was no use trying to explain. "When I drifted in at Abel's this evening, and Sissy told me you'd come here, I was amazed and downright scared. Sissy told me she was worried about you, but hadn't liked to say anything to dissuade you for fear you'd think she was thinking selfishly about herself. So I came on up here instead of going to Deerwood." Valancy felt a sudden delightful glow irradiating soul and body under the dark pines. So he had actually come to look after her. "As soon as they stop hunting for us, we'll sneak around to the Muskoka Road. I left Lady Jane down there. I'll take you home. I suppose you've had enough of your party." "Quite," said Valancy meekly. The first half of the way home, neither of them said anything. It would not have been much use. Lady Jane made so much noise they could not have heard each other. Anyway, Valancy did not feel conversationally inclined. She was ashamed of the whole affair, ashamed of her folly in going, ashamed for being found at such a place by Barney Snaith. By Barney Snaith, reputed jailbreaker, infidel, forger and defaulter. Valancy's lips twitched in the darkness as she thought of it, but she was ashamed. And yet she was enjoying herself, was full of a strange exultation, bumping over that rough road beside Barney Snaith. The big trees shot by them. The tall mulleins stood up along the road in stiff, orderly ranks like companies of soldiers. The thistles looked like drunken fairies or tipsy elves as their car lights passed over them. This was the first time she had ever been in a car. After all, she liked it. She was not in the least afraid, with Barney at the wheel. Her spirits rose rapidly as they tore along. She ceased to feel ashamed. She ceased to feel anything except that she was part of a comet rushing gloriously through the night of space. All at once, just where the pine woods frayed out to the scrub barrens, Lady Jane became quiet. Too quiet. Lady Jane slowed down quietly and stopped. Barney uttered an aghast exclamation, got out, investigated, came apologetically back. "I'm a doddering idiot. Out of gas. I knew I was short when I left home, but I meant to fill up in Deerwood. Then I forgot all about it in my hurry to get to the Corners." "What can we do?" asked Valancy coolly. "I don't know. There's no gas nearer than Deerwood, 9 miles away, and I don't dare leave you here alone. There are always tramps on this road, and some of those crazy fools back at the Corners may come straggling along presently. There were boys there, from the port. As far as I can see, the best thing to do is for us just to sit patiently here until some car comes along and lends us enough gas to get to Roaring Abel's with." "Well, what's the matter with that?" said Valency. "We may have to sit here all night," said Barney. "I don't mind," said Valency. Barney gave a short laugh. "If you don't, I needn't. I haven't any reputation to lose." "Nor I," said Valency comfortably. Chapter 20.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 21. "We'll just sit here," said Barney, "and if we think of anything worthwhile saying, we'll say it. Otherwise, not. Don't imagine you're bound to talk to me." "John Foster says," quoted Valency, "if you can sit in silence with a person for half an hour and yet be entirely comfortable, you and that person can be friends. If you cannot, friends you'll never be, and you need not wasting time in trying." "Evidently John Foster says a sensible thing once in a while," conceded Barney. They sat in silence for a long while. Little rabbits hopped across the road. Once or twice an owl laughed out delightfully. The road beyond them was fringed with the woven shadow lace of trees. Away off to the southwest the sky was full of silvery little cirrus clouds above the spot where Barney's island must be. Valency was perfectly happy. Some things dawn on you slowly. Some things come by lightning flashes. Valency had had a lightning flash. She knew quite well now that she loved Barney. Yesterday she had been all her own. Now she was this man's. Yet he had done nothing, said nothing. He had not even looked at her as a woman, but that didn't matter. Nor did it matter what he was or what he had done. She loved him without any reservations. Everything in her went out wholly to him. She had no wish to stifle or disown her love. She seemed to be his so absolutely that thought apart from him, thought in which he did not predominate, was an impossibility. She had realized, quite simply and fully, that she loved him, in the moment when he was leaning on the car door, explaining that Lady Jane had no gas. She had looked deep into his eyes in the moonlight and had known. In just that infinitesimal space of time, everything was changed. Old things passed away and all things became new. She was no longer unimportant, little old maid Valency Sterling. She was a woman, full of love, and therefore rich and significant, justified to herself. Life was no longer empty and futile, and death could cheat her of nothing. Love had cast out her last fear. Love, what a searing, torturing, intolerably sweet thing it was, this possession of body, soul, and mind, with something at its core as fine and remote and purely spiritual as the tiny blue spark in the heart of the unbreakable diamond. No dream had ever been like this. She was no longer solitary. She was one of a vast sisterhood, all the women who had ever loved in the world. Barney need never know it, though she would not in the least have minded his knowing, but she knew it, and it made a tremendous difference to her. Just to love. She did not ask to be loved. It was rapture enough just to sit there beside him in silence, alone in the summer night in the white splendor of moonshine, with the wind blowing down on them out of the pine woods. She had always envied the wind, so free, blowing where it listed, through the hills, over the lakes. What a tang, what a zip it had, what a magic of adventure. Valency felt as if she had exchanged her shop-worn soul for a fresh one, fire new from the workshop of the gods. As far back as she could look, life had been dull, colorless, savorless. Now she had come to a little patch of violets, purple and fragrant, hers for the plucking. No matter who or what had been in Barney's past, no matter who or what might be in his future. No one else could ever have this perfect hour. She surrendered herself utterly to the charm of the moment. Ever dream of ballooning? Said Barney suddenly. No, said Valancy. I do often dream of sailing through the clouds, seeing the glories of sunset, spending hours in the midst of a terrific storm with lightning playing above and below you, skimming above a silver cloud floor under a full moon. Wonderful. It does sound so, said Valancy. I've stayed on earth in my dreams. She told him about her blue castle. It was so easy to tell Barney things. One felt he understood everything, even the things you didn't tell him. And then she told him a little of her existence before she came to Roaring Abel's. She wanted him to see why she had gone to the dance up back. You see, I've never had any real life, she said. I've just breathed. Every door has always been shut to me. But you're still young, said Barney. Oh, I know. Yes, I'm still young, but that's so different from young, said Valancy bitterly. For a moment she was tempted to tell Barney why her years had nothing to do with her future, but she did not. She was not going to think of death tonight. Though I never was really young, she went on, until tonight, she added in her heart. I never had a life like other girls. You couldn't understand. Why? She had a desperate desire that Barney should know the worst about her. I didn't even love my mother. Isn't it awful that I don't love my mother? Rather awful for her, said Barney dryly. Oh, she didn't know it. She took my love for granted, and I wasn't any use or comfort to her or anybody. I was just a vegetable, and I got tired of it. That's why I came to keep house for Mr. Gay and look after Sissy. And I suppose your people thought you'd gone mad. They did, and do, literally, said Valancy. But it's a comfort to them. They'd rather believe me mad than bad. There's no other alternative. But I've been living since I came to Mr. Gay's. It's been a delightful experience. I suppose I'll pay for it when I have to go back, but I'll have had it. That's true, said Barney. If you buy your experience, it's your own. So it's no matter how much you pay for it. Somebody else's experience can never be yours. Well, it's a funny old world. Do you think it really is old? Asked Valancy dreamily. I never believed that in June. It seems so young tonight, somehow, in that quivering moonlight, like a young white girl waiting. Moonlight here on the verge of up back is different from moonlight anywhere else, agreed Barney. It always makes me feel so clean somehow, body and soul. And of course, the age of gold always comes back in spring. It was 10 o'clock now. A dragon of black cloud ate up the moon. The spring air grew chill. Valancy shivered. Barney reached back into the innards of Lady Jane and clawed up an old tobacco-scented overcoat. Put that on, he ordered. Don't you want it yourself? Protested Valancy. No, I'm not going to have you catching cold on my hands. Oh, I won't catch cold. I haven't had a cold since I came to Mr. Gay's, though I've done the foolishest things. It's funny, too. I used to have them all the time. I feel so selfish taking your coat. You've sneezed 3 times. No use winding up your experience up back with grip or pneumonia. He pulled it up tight about her throat and buttoned it on her. Valancy submitted with secret delight. How nice it was to have someone look after you so. She snuggled down into the tobacco-y folds and wished the night could last forever. 10 minutes later, a car swooped down on them from up back. Barney sprang from Lady Jane and waved his hand. The car came to a stop beside them. Valancy saw Uncle Wellington and Olive gazing at her in horror from it. So Uncle Wellington had got a car. and he must have been spending the evening up at Miss Dawes with Cousin Herbert. Valancy almost laughed aloud at the expression on his face as he recognized her, the pompous, bewhiskered old humbug. "Can you let me have enough gas to take me to Deerwood?" Barney was asking politely, but Uncle Wellington was not attending to him. "Valancy, how came you here?" he said sternly. "By chance, or God's grace," said Valancy. "With this jailbird, at 10 o'clock at night," said Uncle Wellington. Valancy turned to Barney. The moon had escaped from its dragon, and in its light her eyes were full of deviltry. "Are you a jailbird? Does it matter?" said Barney, gleams of fun in his eyes. "Not to me. I only asked out of curiosity," continued Valancy. "Then I won't tell you. I never satisfy curiosity." He turned to Uncle Wellington, and his voice changed subtly. "Mr. Sterling, I asked you if you could let me have some gas. If you can, well and good. If not, we are only delaying you unnecessarily." Uncle Wellington was in a horrible dilemma: to give gas to this shameless pair, but not to give it to them; to go away and leave them there in the Mistawis woods until daylight likely. It was better to give it to them and let them get out of sight before anyone else saw them. "Got anything to get gas in?" he grunted surlily. Barney produced a 2-gallon measure from Lady Jane. The two men went to the rear of the Sterling car and began manipulating the tap. Valancy stole sly glances at Olive over the collar of Barney's coat. Olive was sitting grimly, staring straight ahead with an outraged expression. She did not mean to take any notice of Valancy. Olive had her own secret reasons for feeling outraged. Cecil had been in Deerwood lately, and of course had heard all about Valancy. He agreed that her mind was changed, and was exceedingly anxious to find out whence the derangement had been inherited. It was a serious thing to have in the family, a very serious thing. One had to think of one's descendants. "She got it from the Wansboroughs," said Olive positively. "There's nothing like that in the Sterlings. Nothing." "I hope not. I certainly hope not," Cecil had responded dubiously. "But then, to go out as a servant, for that is what it practically amounts to. Your cousin." Poor Olive felt the implication. The Port Lawrence Prices were not accustomed to ally themselves with families whose members worked out. Valancy could not resist temptation. She leaned forward. "Olive, does it hurt?" Olive bit stiffly. "Does what hurt?" "Looking like that." For a moment Olive resolved she would take no further notice of Valancy. Then duty came uppermost. She must not miss the opportunity. "Doss," she implored, leaning forward also, "won't you come home? Come home tonight." Valancy yawned. "You sound like a revival meeting," she said. "You really do." "If you come back, all will be forgiven." "Yes," said Olive eagerly. "Wouldn't it be splendid if she could induce the prodigal daughter to return? We'll never cast it up to you. Doss, there are nights when I cannot sleep for thinking of you." "And me having the time of my life," said Valancy, laughing. "Doss, I can't believe you're bad. I've always said you couldn't be bad." "I don't believe I can be," said Valancy. "I'm afraid I'm hopelessly proper. I've been sitting here for 3 hours with Barney's Nath, and he hasn't even tried to kiss me. I wouldn't have minded if he had, Olive." Valancy was still leaning forward. Her little hat with its crimson rose was tilted down over one eye. Valancy's smile. What had happened to Valancy? She looked not pretty. Doss couldn't be pretty, but provocative, fascinating, yes, abominably so. Olive drew back. It was beneath her dignity to say more. After all, Valancy must be both mad and bad. "Thanks, that's enough. said Barney behind the car. "Much obliged, Mr. Sterling. 2 gallons, 70 cents. Thank you." Uncle Wellington climbed foolishly and feebly into his car. He wanted to give Snaith a piece of his mind, but dared not. Who knew what the creature might do if provoked? No doubt he carried firearms. Uncle Wellington looked indecisively at Valency, but Valency had turned her back on him and was watching Barney pour the gas into Lady Jane's maw. "Drive on," said Olive decisively. "There's no use in waiting here. Let me tell you what she said to me." "The little hussy, the shameless little hussy," said Uncle Wellington. End of chapter 21.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 22. The next thing the Sterlings heard was that Valency had been seen with Barney Snaith in a movie theatre in Port Lawrence, and after it at supper in a Chinese restaurant there. This was quite true, and no one was more surprised at it than Valency herself. Barney had come along in Lady Jane one dim twilight, and told Valency unceremoniously if she wanted a drive to hop in. "I'm going to the port. Will you go there with me?" His eyes were teasing, and there was a bit of defiance in his voice. Valency, who did not conceal from herself that she would have gone anywhere with him to any place, hopped in without more ado. They tore into and through Deerwood. Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles, taking a little air on the veranda, saw them whirl by in a cloud of dust and sought comfort in each other's eyes. Valency, who in some dim pre-existence had been afraid of a car, was hatless, and her hair was blowing wildly round her face. She would certainly come down with bronchitis and die at Roaring Abel's. She wore a low-neck dress, and her arms were bare. That Snaith creature was in his shirt-sleeves, smoking a pipe. They were going at the rate of 40 miles an hour. 60, Cousin Stickles averred. Lady Jane could hit the pike when she wanted to. Valency waved her hand gaily to her relatives. As for Mrs. Frederick, she was wishing she knew how to go into hysterics. "Was it for this," she demanded in hollow tones, "that I suffered the pangs of motherhood?" "I will not believe," said Cousin Stickles solemnly, "that our prayers will not yet be answered." Who will protect that unfortunate girl when I am gone?" moaned Mrs. Frederick. As for Valency, she was wondering if it could really be only a few weeks since she had sat there with them on that veranda, hating the rubber plant, pestered with teasing questions like black flies, always thinking of appearances, cowed because of old Wellington's teaspoons and Uncle Benjamin's money, poverty-stricken, afraid of everybody, envying Olive, a slave to moth-eaten traditions, nothing to hope for or expect. And now every day was a gay adventure. Lady Jane flew over the 15 miles between Deerwood and the port, through the port. The way Barney went past traffic policemen was not holly. The lights were beginning to twinkle out like stars in the clear, lemon-hued twilight air. This was the only time Valency ever really liked the town, and she was crazy with the delight of speeding. Was it possible she had ever been afraid of a car? She was perfectly happy, riding beside Barney. Not that she deluded herself into thinking it had any significance. She knew quite well that Barney had asked her to go on the impulse of the moment, an impulse born of a feeling of pity for her and her starved little dreams. She was looking tired after a wakeful night with a heart attack followed by a busy day. She had so little fun. He'd given her an outing for once. Besides, Abel was in the kitchen, at the point of drunkenness where he was declaring he did not believe in God and beginning to sing ribald songs. It was just as well she should be out of the way for a while. Barney knew Roaring Abel's repertoire. They went to the movie. Valency had never been to a movie. And then, finding a nice hunger upon them, they went and had fried chicken, unbelievably delicious, in the Chinese restaurant. After which they rattled home again, leaving a devastating trail of scandal behind them. Mrs. Frederick gave up going to church altogether. She could not endure her friends' pitying glances and questions. But Cousin Stickles went every Sunday. She said they had been given a cross to bear. End of chapter 23.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. On one of Cissy's wakeful nights, she told Valency her poor little story. They were sitting by the open window. Cissy could not get her breath lying down that night. An inglorious gibbous moon was hanging over the wooded hills, and, in its spectral light, Cissy looked frail and lovely and incredibly young. A child. It did not seem possible that she could have lived through all the passion and pain and shame of her story. He was stopping at the hotel across the lake. He used to come over in his canoe at night. We met in the pines down the shore. He was a young college student. His father was a rich man in Toronto. Oh, Valency, I didn't mean to be bad. I didn't, indeed. But I loved him so. I love him yet. I'll always love him. And I didn't know some things. I didn't understand. Then his father came and took him away. And, after a little, I found out. Oh, Valency, I was so frightened. I didn't know what to do. I wrote him and he came. He said he would marry me, Valency. And why? And why? Oh, Valency, he didn't love me any more. I saw that at a glance. He was just offering to marry me because he thought he ought to, because he was sorry for me. He wasn't bad, but he was so young, and what was I that he should keep on loving me? Never mind making excuses for him, said Valency, a bit shortly. So you wouldn't marry him? I couldn't, not when he didn't love me any more. Somehow, I can't explain, it seemed a worse thing to do than the other. He argued a little, but he went away. Do you think I did right, Valency? Yes, I do. You did right, but he... Don't blame him, dear. Please don't. Let's not talk about him at all. There's no need. I wanted to tell you how it was. I didn't want you to think me bad. I never did think so. Yes, I felt that, whenever you came. Oh, Valency, what you've been to me! I can never tell you, but God will bless you for it. I know He will. With what measure ye meet. Cissy sobbed for a few minutes in Valency's arms. Then she wiped her eyes. Well, that's almost all. I came home. I wasn't really so very unhappy. I suppose I should have been, but I wasn't. Father wasn't hard on me, and my baby was so sweet, Valency, with such lovely blue eyes and little rings of pale gold hair like silk floss, and tiny dimpled hands. I used to bite his satin-smooth little face all over softly, so as not to hurt him, you know. I know, said Valency, wincing. I know. A woman always knows, and dreams. And he was all mine. Nobody else had any claim on him. When he died, oh, Valency, I thought I must die too. I didn't see how anybody could endure such anguish and live. To see his dear little eyes and know he would never open them again, to miss his warm little body nestled against mine at night, and think of him sleeping alone and cold, his wee face under the hard frozen earth. It was so awful for the first year. After that it was a little easier. One didn't keep thinking, this day last year. But I was so glad when I found out I was dying. Who could endure life if it were not for the hope of death? Murmured Valancy softly. It was, of course, a quotation from some book of John Foster's. I'm glad I told you all about it, sighed Sissy. I wanted you to know. Sissy died a few nights after that. Roaring Abel was away. When Valancy saw the change that had come over Sissy's face, she wanted to telephone for the doctor, but Sissy wouldn't let her. Valancy, why should you? He can do nothing for me. I've known for several days that this was near. Let me die in peace, dear, just holding your hand. Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Tell father good-bye for me. He's always been as good to me as he knew how. And Barney. Somehow I think that Barney. But a spasm of coughing interrupted and exhausted her. She fell asleep when it was over, still holding to Valancy's hand. Valancy sat there in the silence. She was not frightened or even sorry. At sunrise, Sissy died. She opened her eyes and looked past Valancy at something that made her smile suddenly and happily, and smiling, she died. Valancy crossed Sissy's hands on her breast and went to the open window. In the eastern sky, amid the fires of sunrise, an old moon was hanging, as slender and lovely as a new moon. Valancy had never seen an old, old moon before. She watched it pale and fade until it paled and faded out of sight in the living rose of day. A little pool in the barrens shone in the sunrise, like a great golden lily. But the world suddenly seemed a colder place to Valancy. Again, nobody needed her. She was not in the least sorry Cecilia was dead. She was only sorry for all her suffering in life. But nobody could ever hurt her again. Valancy had always thought death dreadful, but Sissy had died so quietly, so pleasantly, and at the very last, something had made up to her for everything. She was lying there now, in her white sleep, looking like a child. Beautiful! All the lines of shame and pain gone. Roaring Abel drove in, justifying his name. Valancy went down and told him. The shock sobered him at once. He slumped down on the seat of his buggy, his great head hanging. Sissy dead! Sissy dead! He said vacantly. I didn't think it would come so soon. Dead. She used to run down the lane to meet me with a little white rose stuck in her hair. Sissy used to be a pretty little girl, and a good little girl. She has always been a good little girl, said Valancy. End of chapter 23. The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Valancy herself made Sissy ready for burial. No hands but hers should touch that pitiful, wasted little body. The old house was spotless on the day of burial. Barney Snaith was not there. He had done all he could to help Valancy before it. He had shrouded the pale Cecilia in white roses from the garden, and then had gone back to his island. But everybody else was there. All Deerwood and up back came. They forgave Sissy splendidly at last. Mr. Bradley gave a very beautiful funeral address. Valancy had wanted her old Free Methodist man, but Roaring Abel was obdurate. He was a Presbyterian, and no one but a Presbyterian minister should bury his daughter. Mr. Bradley was very tactful. He avoided all dubious points, and it was plain to be seen he hoped for the best. 6 reputable citizens of Deerwood bore Cecilia Gay to her grave in decorous Deerwood Cemetery. Among them was Uncle Wellington. The Sterlings all came to the funeral, men and women. They had had a family conclave over it. Surely now that Sissy Gay was dead, Valancy would come home. She simply could not stay there with Roaring Abel. That being the case, the wisest course, decreed Uncle James, was to attend the funeral, legitimize the whole thing, so to speak, show Deerwood that Valency had really done a most creditable deed in going to nurse poor Cecilia Gay, and that her family backed her up in it. Death, the miracle worker, suddenly made the thing quite respectable. If Valency would return to home and decency while public opinion was under its influence, all might yet be well. Society was suddenly forgetting all Cecilia's wicked doings, and remembering what a pretty, modest little thing she had been. And motherless, you know, motherless. It was a psychological moment, said Uncle James. So the Sterlings went to the funeral. Even Cousin Gladys's neuritis allowed her to come. Cousin Stickles was there, her bonnet dripping all over her face, crying as woefully as if Sissy had been her nearest and dearest. Funerals always brought Cousin Stickles' own sad bereavement back. And Uncle Wellington was a pallbearer. Valency, pale, subdued looking, her slanted eyes smudged with purple, in her snuff-brown dress, moving quietly about, finding seats for people, consulting in undertones with minister and undertaker, marshalling the mourners into the parlor, was so decorous and proper and Sterlingish that her family took heart of grace. This was not, could not be, the girl who had sat all night in the woods with Barney Snaith, who had gone tearing bareheaded through Deerwood and Port Lawrence. This was the Valency they knew, really surprisingly capable and efficient. Perhaps she had always been kept down a bit too much. Amelia really was rather strict, hadn't had a chance to show what was in her. So thought the Sterlings. And Edward Beck, from the Port Road, a widower with a large family who was beginning to take notice, took notice of Valency and thought she might make a mighty fine second wife. No beauty, but a 50-year-old widower, Mr. Beck told himself very reasonably, couldn't expect everything. Altogether, it seemed that Valency's matrimonial chances were never so bright as they were at Cecilia Gay's funeral. What the Sterlings and Edward Beck would have thought, had they known the back of Valency's mind, must be left to the imagination. Valency was hating the funeral, hating the people who came to stare with curiosity at Cecilia's marble-white face, hating the smugness, hating the dragging, melancholy singing, hating Mr. Bradley's cautious platitudes. If she could have had her absurd way, there would have been no funeral at all. She would have covered Cissy over with flowers, shut her away from prying eyes, and buried her beside her nameless little baby in the grassy burying ground under the pines of the Upback Church, with a bit of kindly prayer from the old Free Methodist minister. She remembered Cissy saying once, "I wish I could be buried deep in the heart of the woods, where nobody would ever come to say, 'Cissy Gay is buried here,' and tell over my miserable story." But this, however, it would soon be over. Valency knew, if the Sterlings and Edward Beck didn't, exactly what she intended to do then. She had lain awake all the preceding night, thinking about it and finally deciding on it. When the funeral procession had left the house, Mrs. Frederick sought out Valency in the kitchen. "My child," she said tremulously, "you'll come home now?" "Home," said Valency absently. She was getting on an apron and calculating how much tea she must put to steep for supper. There would be several guests from "up back," distant relatives of the Gays who had not remembered them for years, and she was so tired she wished she could borrow a pair of legs from the cat. "Yes, home," said Mrs. Frederick, with a touch of asperity. "I suppose you won't dream of staying here now, alone with Roaring Abel." "Oh, no, I'm not going to stay here," said Valency. "Of course I'll have to stay for a day or two, to put the house in order generally, but that will be all. Excuse me, Mother, won't you? I've a frightful lot to do. All those up back people will be here to supper." Mrs. Frederick retreated in considerable relief, and the Sterlings went home with lighter hearts. We will just treat her as if nothing had happened when she comes back, decreed Uncle Benjamin. That will be the best plan. Just as if nothing had happened. End of chapter 24.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 25. On the evening of the day after the funeral, Roaring Abel went off for a spree. He had been sober for 4 whole days, and could endure it no longer. Before he went, Valancy told him she would be going away the next day. Roaring Abel was sorry and said so. A distant cousin from up back was coming to keep house for him, quite willing to do so now, since there was no sick girl to wait on. But Abel was not under any delusions concerning her. "She won't be like you, my girl. Well, I'm obliged to you. You helped me out of a bad hole, and I won't forget it. And I won't forget what you did for Sissy. I'm your friend, and if you ever want any of the Sterlings spanked and sought in a corner, send for me. I'm going to wet my whistle, Lord, but I'm dry. Don't reckon I'll be back afore tomorrow night, so if you're going home tomorrow, goodbye now." "I may go home tomorrow," said Valancy, "but I'm not going to Deerwood." "Not going? You'll find the key on the woodshed nail," interrupted Valancy politely and unmistakably. "The dog will be in the barn, and the cat in the cellar. Don't forget to feed her till your cousin comes. The pantry is full, and I made some bread and pies today. Goodbye, Mr. Gay. You have been very kind to me, and I appreciate it." "We've had a damned decent time of it together, and that's a fact," said Roaring Abel. "You're the best small sport in the world, and your little finger is worth the whole Sterling clan tied together. Goodbye, and good luck." Valancy went out to the garden. Her legs trembled a little, but otherwise she felt and looked composed. She held something tightly in her hand. The garden was lying in the magic of the warm, odorous July twilight. A few stars were out, and the robins were calling through the velvety silences of the barrens. Valancy stood by the gate expectantly. Would he come? If he did not, he was coming. Valancy heard Lady Jane Grey far back in the woods. Her breath came a little more quickly, nearer and nearer. She could see Lady Jane now, bumping down the lane. Nearer, nearer. He was there. He had sprung from the car and was leaning over the gate, looking at her. "Going home, Miss Sterling?" "I don't know yet," said Valancy slowly. Her mind was made up, with no shadow of turning, but the moment was very tremendous. "I thought I'd run down and ask if there was anything I could do for you," said Barney. Valancy took it with a canter. "Yes, there is something you can do for me," she said evenly and distinctly. "Will you marry me?" For a moment Barney was silent. There was no particular expression on his face. Then he gave an odd laugh. "Come now, I knew luck was just waiting around the corner for me. All the signs have been pointing that way today." "Wait," Valancy lifted her hand. "I'm in earnest, but I want to get my breath after that question. Of course, with my bringing up, I realize perfectly well that this is one of the things a lady should not do." "But why? Why?" "For 2 reasons." Valancy was still a little breathless, but she looked Barney straight in the eyes, while all the dead Sterlings revolved rapidly in their graves, and the living ones did nothing because they did not know that Valancy was at that moment proposing lawful marriage to the notorious Barney Snaith. "The first reason is, Valancy tried to say I love you, but could not. She had to take refuge in a pretended flippancy. "I'm crazy about you. The second is this." She handed him Dr. Trent's letter. Barney opened it with the air of a man thankful to find some safe, sane thing to do. As he read it, his face changed. He understood, more perhaps than Valancy wanted him to. "Are you sure nothing can be done for you?" Valancy did not misunderstand the question. Yes, you know Dr. Trent's reputation in regard to heart disease. I haven't long to live, perhaps only a few months, a few weeks. I want to live them. I can't go back to Deerwood. You know what my life was like there, and she managed it this time. I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. That's all. Barney folded his arms on the gate and looked gravely enough at a white, saucy star that was winking at him just over Roaring Abel's kitchen chimney. You don't know anything about me. I may be a murderer. No, I don't. You may be something dreadful. Everything they say of you may be true, but it doesn't matter to me. You care that much for me, Valancy? Said Barney incredulously, looking away from the star and into her eyes, her strange, mysterious eyes. I care that much, said Valancy in a low voice. She was trembling. He had called her by her name for the first time. It was sweeter than another man's caress could have been just to hear him say her name like that. If we are going to get married, said Barney, speaking suddenly in a casual, matter-of-fact voice, some things must be understood. Everything must be understood, said Valancy. I have things I want to hide, said Barney coolly. You are not to ask me about them. I won't, said Valancy. You must never ask to see my mail. Never. And we are never to pretend anything to each other. We won't, said Valancy. You won't even have to pretend you like me. If you marry me, I know you're only doing it out of pity. And we'll never tell a lie to each other about anything, a big lie or a petty lie. Especially a petty lie, agreed Valancy. And you'll have to live on my island. I won't live anywhere else. That's partly why I want to marry you, said Valancy. Barney peered at her. I believe you mean it. Well, let's get married then. Thank you, said Valancy with a sudden return of primness. She would have been much less embarrassed if he had refused her. I suppose I haven't any right to make conditions, but I'm going to make one. You are never to refer to my heart or my liability to sudden death. You are never to urge me to be careful. You are to forget, absolutely forget, that I am not perfectly healthy. I have written a letter to my mother. Here it is. You are to keep it. I have explained everything in it. If I drop dead suddenly, as I likely will do, it will exonerate me in the eyes of your kindred from suspicions of having poisoned you, said Barney with a grin. Exactly, Valancy laughed gaily. Dear me, I'm glad this is over. It has been a bit of an ordeal. You see, I'm not in the habit of going about asking men to marry me. It is so nice of you not to refuse me, or offer to be a brother. I'll go to the port tomorrow and get a license. We can be married tomorrow evening. Dr. Stalling, I suppose. Heavens, no, Valancy shuddered. Besides, he wouldn't do it. He'd shake his forefinger at me, and I'd jilt you at the altar. No, I want my old Mr. Towers to marry me. Will you marry me as I stand? Demanded Barney. A passing car full of tourists honked loudly. It seemed derisively. Valancy looked at him. Blue homespun shirt, nondescript hat, muddy overalls, unshaved. Yes, she said. Barney put his hands over the gate and took her little cold ones gently in his. Valancy, he said, trying to speak lightly, of course I am not in love with you. Never thought of such a thing as being in love. But do you know, I've always thought you were a bit of a dear. End of chapter 25. The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 26. The next day passed for Valancy like a dream. She could not make herself or anything she did seem real. She saw nothing of Barney, though she expected he must go rattling past on his way to the port for a license. Perhaps he had changed his mind. But at dusk the lights of Lady Jane suddenly swooped over the crest of the wooded hill beyond the lane. Valancy was waiting at the gate for her bridegroom. She wore her green dress and her green hat because she had nothing else to wear. She did not look or feel at all bride-like. She really looked like a wild elf strayed out of the greenwood. But that did not matter. Nothing at all mattered except Barney was coming for her. "Ready?" said Barney, stopping Lady Jane with some new horrible noises. "Yes." Valancy stepped in and sat down. Barney was in his blue shirt and overalls, but they were clean overalls. He was smoking a villainous-looking pipe, and he was bareheaded, but he had a pair of oddly smart boots on under his shabby overalls, and he was shaved. They clattered into Deerwood and through Deerwood and hit the long wooded road to the port. "Haven't you changed your mind?" said Barney. "No. Have you?" "No." That was their whole conversation on the 15 miles. Everything was more dreamlike than ever. Valancy didn't know whether she felt happy or terrified or just plain fool. Then the lights of Port Lawrence were about them. Valancy felt as if she were surrounded by the gleaming, hungry eyes of hundreds of great, stealthy panthers. Barney briefly asked where Mr. Towers lived, and Valancy as briefly told him. They stopped before the shabby little house in an unfashionable street. They went into the small, shabby parlor. Barney produced his license, so he had got it. Also, a ring. This ring was real. She, Valancy Sterling, was actually on the point of being married. They were standing up together before Mr. Towers. Valancy heard Mr. Towers and Barney saying things. She heard some other person saying things. She herself was thinking of the way she had once planned to be married, away back in her early teens when such a thing had not seemed impossible. White silk and tulle veil and orange blossoms. No bridesmaid, but one flower girl in a frock of cream shadow lace over pale pink, with a wreath of flowers in her hair, carrying a basket of roses and lilies of the valley. And the groom, a noble-looking character, irreproachably clad in whatever the fashion of the day decreed. Valancy lifted her eyes and saw herself and Barney in the little slanting, distorted mirror over the mantelpiece. She in her odd, unbridled green hat and dress, Barney in shirt and overalls. But it was Barney. That was all that mattered. No veil, no flowers, no guests, no presents, no wedding cake. But just Barney. For all the rest of her life there would be Barney. "Mrs. Snaith, I hope you will be very happy," Mr. Towers was saying. He had not seemed surprised at their appearance, not even at Barney's overalls. He had seen plenty of queer weddings up back. He did not know Valancy was one of the Deerwood Sterlings. He did not even know there were Deerwood Sterlings. He did not know Barney Snaith was a fugitive from justice. Really, he was an incredibly ignorant old man. Therefore, he married them and gave them his blessing very gently and solemnly and prayed for them that night after they had gone away. His conscience did not trouble him at all. "What a nice way to get married," Barney was saying as he put Lady Jane in gear. "No fuss and flub-dub. I never supposed it was half so easy." "For heaven's sake," said Valancy suddenly, "let's forget we are married and talk as if we weren't. I can't stand another drive like the one we had coming in." Barney howled and threw Lady Jane into high with an infernal noise. "And I thought I was making it easy for you," he said. "You didn't seem to want to talk." "I didn't, but I wanted you to talk. I don't want you to make love to me, but I want you to act like an ordinary human being. Tell me about this island of yours. What sort of place is it?" "The jolliest place in the world. You're going to love it. The first time I saw it, I loved it. Old Tom McMurray owned it then. He built the little shack on it, lived there in winter, and rented it to Toronto people in summer. I bought it from him, became by that one simple transaction a landed proprietor, owning a house and an island. There's something so satisfying in owning a whole island. And isn't an uninhabited island a charming idea? I'd wanted to own one ever since I'd read Robinson Crusoe. It seemed too good to be true. And beauty! Most of the scenery belongs to the government, but they don't tax you for looking at it. And the moon belongs to everybody. You won't find my shack very tidy. I suppose you'll want to make it tidy. Yes, said Valancy honestly. I have to be tidy. I don't really want to be, but untidiness hurts me. Yes, I'll have to tidy up your shack. I was prepared for that, said Barney with a hollow groan. But, continued Valancy relentingly, I won't insist on your wiping your feet when you come in. No, you'll only sweep up after me with the air of a martyr, said Barney. Well, anyway, you can't tidy up the lean-to. You can't even enter it. The door will be locked, and I shall keep the key. Bluebeard's chamber, said Valancy. I shan't even think of it. I don't care how many wives you have hanging up in it, so long as they're really dead. Dead as doornails. You can do as you like in the rest of the house. There's not much of it. Just one big living room and one small bedroom. Well built, though. Old Tom loved his job. The beams of our house are cedar and the rafters fir. Our living room windows face west and east. It's wonderful to have a room where you can see both sunrise and sunset. I have 2 cats there, Banjo and Good Luck. Adorable animals. Banjo is a big, enchanting gray devil cat. Striped, of course. I don't care a hang for any cat that hasn't stripes. I never knew a cat who could swear as genteelly and effectively as Banjo. His only fault is that he snores horribly when he is asleep. Luck is a dainty little cat, always looking wistfully at you as if he wanted to tell you something. Maybe he will pull it off sometime. Once in 1,000 years, you know, one cat is allowed to speak. My cats are philosophers. Neither of them ever cries over spilt milk. 2 old crows live in a pine tree on the point and are reasonably neighborly. Call 'em Nip and Tuck. And I have a demure little tame owl named Leander. I brought him up from a baby, and he lives over on the mainland and chuckles to himself o' nights. And bats? It's a great place for bats at night. Scared of bats? No, I like them. So do I. Nice, queer, uncanny, mysterious creatures. Coming from nowhere, going nowhere. Swoop. Banjo likes 'em too. Eats 'em. I have a canoe and a disappearing propeller boat. Went to the port in it today to get my license. Quieter than Lady Jane. I thought you hadn't gone at all, that you had changed your mind, admitted Valancy. Barney laughed. The laugh Valancy did not like, the little bitter, cynical laugh. I never change my mind, he said shortly. They went back through Deerwood, up the Muskoka Road, past Roaring Abel's, over the rocky daisied lane. The dark pine woods swallowed them up. Through the pine woods, where the air was sweet with the incense of the unseen fragile bells of the linnaeas that carpeted the banks of the trail, out to the shore of Mistawas. Lady Jane must be left here. They got out. Barney led the way down a little path to the edge of the lake. There's our island, he said gloatingly. Valancy looked and looked and looked again. There was a diaphanous lilac mist on the lake, shrouding the island. Through it the 2 enormous pine trees that clasped hands over Barney's shack loomed out like dark turrets. Behind them was a sky still rose-hued in the afterlight, and a pale young moon. Valancy shivered like a tree the wind stirs suddenly. Something seemed to sweep over her soul. "My blue castle!" she said. "Oh, my blue castle!" They got into the canoe and paddled out to it. They left behind the realm of everyday and things known, and landed on a realm of mystery and enchantment, where anything might happen, anything might be true. Barney lifted Valancy out of the canoe and swung her to a lichen-covered rock under a young pine tree. His arms were about her, and suddenly his lips were on hers. Valancy found herself shivering with the rapture of her first kiss. "Welcome home, dear," Barney was saying. End of chapter 26.
Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 27. Cousin Georgiana came down the lane leading up to her little house. She lived half a mile out of Deerwood, and she wanted to go into Amelia's and find out if Dawes had come home yet. Cousin Georgiana was anxious to see Dawes. She had something very important to tell her, something she was sure Dawes would be delighted to hear. Poor Dawes. She had had rather a dull life of it. Cousin Georgiana owned to herself that she would not like to live under Amelia's thumb. But that would all be changed now. Cousin Georgiana felt tremendously important. For the time being, she quite forgot to wonder which of them would go next. And here was Dawes herself, coming along the road from Roaring Abel's in such a queer green dress and hat. Talk about luck! Cousin Georgiana would have a chance to impart her wonderful secret right away, with nobody else about to interrupt. It was, you might say, Providence. Valancy, who had been living for 4 days on her enchanted island, had decided that she might as well go into Deerwood and tell her relatives that she was married. Otherwise, finding that she had disappeared from Roaring Abel's, they might get out a search warrant for her. Barney had offered to drive her in, but she had preferred to go alone. She smiled very radiantly at Cousin Georgiana, who she remembered as of someone known long time ago, had really not been a bad little creature. Valancy was so happy that she could have smiled at anybody, even Uncle James. She was not averse to Cousin Georgiana's company. Already, since the houses along the road were becoming numerous, she was conscious that curious eyes were looking at her from every window. "I suppose you're going home, dear Dawes," said Cousin Georgiana, as she shook hands furtively eyeing Valancy's dress and wondering if she had any petticoat on at all. "Sooner or later," said Valancy cryptically. "Then I'll go along with you. I've been wanting to see you very especially, Dawes dear. I have something quite wonderful to tell you." "Yes?" said Valancy absently. What on earth was Cousin Georgiana looking so mysterious and important about? But did it matter? No, nothing mattered but Barney and the Blue Castle up back in Mistovis. "Who do you suppose called to see me the other day?" asked Cousin Georgiana archly. Valancy couldn't guess. "Edward Beck." Cousin Georgiana lowered her voice almost to a whisper. "Edward Beck." Why the italics? And was Cousin Georgiana blushing? "Who on earth is Edward Beck?" asked Valancy indifferently. Cousin Georgiana stared. "Surely you remember Edward Beck," she said reproachfully. "He lives in that lovely house on the Port Lawrence Road, and he comes to our church regularly. You must remember him." "Oh, I think I do now," said Valancy with an effort of memory. "He is that old man with a wen on his forehead and dozens of children, who always sits in the pew by the door, isn't he?" "Not dozens of children, dear. Oh, no, not dozens. Not even 1 dozen. Only 9. At least only 9 that count. The rest are dead. He isn't old. He is only about 48, the prime of life. Dawes, and what does it matter about a wen?" "Nothing, of course," agreed Valancy quite sincerely. It certainly did not matter to her whether Edward Beck had a wen, or a dozen wens, or no wen at all. But Valancy was getting vaguely suspicious. There was certainly an air of suppressed triumph about Cousin Georgiana. Could it be possible that Cousin Georgiana was thinking of marrying again? Marrying Edward Beck? Absurd. Cousin Georgiana was 65. If she were a day, and her little anxious face was as closely covered with fine wrinkles as if she had been 100. But still, "My dear," said Cousin Georgiana, "Edward Beck wants to marry you." Valancy stared at Cousin Georgiana for a moment. Then she wanted to go into a peal of laughter. But she only said, "Me?" "Yes, you. He fell in love with you at the funeral, and he came to consult me about it. I was such a friend of his first wife, you know. He is very much in earnest, Dawsey, and it's a wonderful chance for you. He is very well off, and you know, you... "I'm not so young as I once was," agreed Valancy. To her that shall be given. Do you really think I would make a good stepmother, Cousin Georgiana? I'm sure you would. You were always so fond of children. But 9 is such a family to start with, objected Valency gravely. The 2 oldest are grown up, and the third almost. That leaves only 6 that really count, and most of them are boys. So much easier to bring up than girls. There's an excellent book, Health Care of the Growing Child. Gladys has a copy, I think. It would be such a help to you. And there are books about morals. You'd manage nicely. Of course, I told Mr. Beck that I thought you would jump at him, supplied Valency. Oh, no, no, dear. I wouldn't use such an indelicate expression. I told him I thought you would consider his proposal favorably. And you will, won't you, dearie? There's only one obstacle, said Valency dreamily. You see, I'm married already. Married? Cousin Georgiana stopped stock still and stared at Valency. Married? Yes, I was married to Barney Smith last Tuesday evening at Port Lawrence. There was a convenient gate post hard by. Cousin Georgiana took firm hold of it. Doss, dear, I'm an old woman. Are you trying to make fun of me? Not at all. I'm only telling you the truth, for heaven's sake. Cousin Georgiana. Valency was alarmed by certain symptoms. Don't go crying here on the public road. Cousin Georgiana choked back the tears and gave a moan of despair instead. Oh, Doss, what have you done? What have you done? I've just been telling you I've got married, said Valency calmly and patiently. To that Barney Snaith? Why, they say he's had a dozen wives already. I'm the only one round at present, said Valency. What will your poor mother say? Moaned Cousin Georgiana. Come along with me and hear if you want to know, said Valency. Cousin Georgiana let go the gatepost cautiously and found that she could stand alone. She meekly trotted on beside Valency, who suddenly seemed quite a different person in her eyes. Cousin Georgiana had a tremendous respect for a married woman, but it was terrible to think of what the poor girl had done. So rash, so reckless. Of course, Valency must be stark mad, but she seemed so happy in her madness that Cousin Georgiana had a momentary conviction that it would be a pity if the clan tried to scold her back to sanity. She had never seen that look in Valency's eyes before. But what would Amelia say? And Ben? To marry a man you know nothing about, thought Cousin Georgiana aloud. I know more about him than I know of Edward Beck, said Valency. Edward Beck goes to church, said Cousin Georgiana. Does your husband? He has promised that he will go with me on fine Sundays, said Valency. When they turned in at the Sterling gate, Valency gave an exclamation of surprise. Look at my rose bush! Why, it's blooming! It was covered with blossoms, great, crimson, velvety blossoms, fragrant, glowing, wonderful. My cutting it down to pieces must have done it good, said Valency, laughing. She gathered a handful of the blossoms. They would look well on the supper table of the veranda at Miss Tavis, and went still laughing up the walk, conscious that Olive was standing on the steps. Olive, goddess-like in loveliness, looking down with a slight frown on her forehead. Olive, beautiful, insolent, her full form voluptuous in its swathings of rose silk and lace, her golden brown hair curling richly under her big white frilled hat, her color ripe and melting. Beautiful, thought Valency coolly, but, as if she suddenly saw her cousin through new eyes, without the slightest touch of distinction. So Valency had come home. Thank goodness, thought Olive. But Valency was not looking like a repentant returned prodigal. This was the cause of Olive's frown. She was looking triumphant, graceless. The outlandish dress, that queer hat, those hands full of blood-red roses. Yet there was something about both dress and hat, as Olive instantly felt, that was entirely lacking in her own attire. This deepened the frown. She put out a condescending hand. So you're back, Doss? Very warm day, isn't it? Did you walk in? Yes. Coming in? Oh, no, I've just been in. I've come often to comfort poor auntie. She's been so lonesome. I'm going to Mrs. Bartlett's tea. I have to help poor. She's giving it for her cousin from Toronto. Such a charming girl. You'd have loved meeting her, Doss. I think Mrs. Bartlett did send you a card. Perhaps you'll drop in later on. No, I don't think so, said Valancy indifferently. I'll have to be home to get Barney's supper. We're going for a moonlit canoe ride around Mistava tonight. Barney? Supper? Gasped Olive. What do you mean, Valancy Sterling? Valancy Snaith, by the grace of God. Valancy flaunted her wedding ring in Olive's stricken face. Then she nimbly stepped past her and into the house. Cousin Georgiana followed. She would not miss the moment of the great scene, even though Olive did look as if she were going to faint. Olive did not faint. She went stupidly down the street to Mrs. Bartlett's. What did those mean? She couldn't have that ring. Oh, what fresh scandal was that wretched girl bringing on her defenseless family now? She should have been shut up long ago. Valancy opened the sitting-room door and stepped unexpectedly right into a grim assemblage of Sterlings. They had not come together of malice prepense. Aunt Wellington and Cousin Gladys and Aunt Mildred and Cousin Sarah had just called in on their way home from a meeting of the Missionary Society. Uncle James had dropped in to give Amelia some information regarding a doubtful investment. Uncle Benjamin had called, apparently, to tell them it was a hot day and ask them what was the difference between a bee and a donkey. Cousin Stickles had been tactless enough to know the answer. One gets all the honey, the other gets all the wax. And Uncle Benjamin was in a bad humor. In all of their minds, unexpressed was the idea of finding out if Valancy had yet come home, and if not, what steps must be taken in that matter. Well, here was Valancy at last. A poised, confident thing, not humble and deprecating as she should have been, and so oddly, improperly young-looking. She stood in the doorway and looked at them. Cousin Georgiana, timorous, expectant, behind her. Valancy was so happy. She didn't hate her people anymore. She could even see a number of good qualities in them that she had never seen before, and she was sorry for them. Her pity made her quite gentle. "Well, mother," she said pleasantly. "So, you've come home at last," said Mrs. Frederick, getting out a handkerchief. She dared not be outraged, but she did not mean to be cheated of her tears. "Well, not exactly," said Valancy. She threw her bomb. "I thought I ought to drop in and tell you I was married last Tuesday night to Barney Snaith." Uncle Benjamin bounced up and sat down again. "God bless my soul," he said dully. The rest seemed turned to stone, except Cousin Gladys, who turned faint. Aunt Mildred and Uncle Wellington had to help her out to the kitchen. She would have to keep up the Victorian traditions, said Valancy with a grin. She sat down uninvited on a chair. Cousin Stickles had begun to sob. "Is there one day in your life that you haven't cried?" asked Valancy curiously. "Valancy," said Uncle James, being the first to recover the power of utterance, "did you mean what you said just now?" "I did." "Do you mean to say that you have actually gone and married that notorious Barney Snaith, that criminal, that—" "I have." "Then," said Uncle James violently, "you are a shameless creature, lost to all sense of propriety and virtue, and I wash my hands entirely of you. I do not want ever to see your face again." "What have you left to say when I commit murder?" asked Valancy. Uncle Benjamin again appealed to God to bless his soul. "That drunken outlaw, that—" A dangerous spark appeared in Valancy's eyes. They might say what they liked too, and of her, but they should not abuse Barney. "Say damn, and you'll feel better," she suggested. "I can express my feelings without blasphemy. And I tell you, you have covered yourself with eternal disgrace and infamy by marrying that drunkard. You would be more endurable if you got drunk occasionally. Barney is not a drunkard. He was seen drunk in Port Lawrence, pickled to the gills," said Uncle Benjamin. "If that is true, and I don't believe it, he had a good reason for it. Now, I suggest that you all stop looking tragic and accept the situation. I'm married. You can't undo that, and I'm perfectly happy. I suppose we ought to be thankful he has really married her," said Cousin Sarah, by way of trying to look on the bright side. "If he really has," said Uncle James, who had just washed his hands of Valancy. "Who married you?" "Mr. Towers of Port Lawrence." "By a free Methodist?" groaned Mrs. Frederick. As if to have been married by an imprisoned Methodist would have been a shade less disgraceful. It was the first thing she had said. Mrs. Frederick didn't know what to say. The whole thing was too horrible, too nightmarish. She was sure she must wake up soon, after all their bright hopes at the funeral. "It makes me think of those what do you call 'em?" said Uncle Benjamin helplessly. "Those yarns, of fairies taking babies out of their cradles." "Valency could hardly be a changeling at 29, said Aunt Wellington satirically. "She was the oddest looking baby I ever saw anyway," averred Uncle Benjamin. "I said so at the time, you remember, Amelia? I said I have never seen such eyes in a human head." "I'm glad I never had any children," said Cousin Sarah. "If they don't break your heart in one way, they do it in another." "Isn't it better to have your heart broken than to have it wither up?" queried Valency. "Before it could be broken, it must have felt something splendid that would be worth the pain." "Dippy, clean Dippy," muttered Uncle Benjamin, with a vague, unsatisfactory feeling that somebody had said something like that before. "Valency," said Mrs. Frederick solemnly, "do you ever pray to be forgiven for disobeying your mother?" "I should pray to be forgiven for obeying you so long," said Valency stubbornly. "But I don't pray about that at all. I just thank God every day for my happiness." "I would rather," said Mrs. Frederick, beginning to cry rather belatedly, "see you dead before me than listen to what you have told me today." Valency looked at her mother and aunts and wondered if they could ever have known anything of the real meaning of love. She felt sorrier for them than ever. They were so very pitiable, and they never suspected it. "Barney Snaith is a scoundrel to have deluded you into marrying him," said Uncle James violently. "Oh, I did the deluding. I asked him to marry me," said Valency with a wicked smile. "Have you no pride?" demanded Aunt Wellington. "Lots of it. I am proud that I have achieved a husband by my own unaided efforts. Cousin Georgiana here wanted to help me to Edward Beck. Edward Beck is worth $20,000 and has the finest house between here and Port Lawrence," said Uncle Benjamin. "That sounds very fine," said Valency scornfully. "But it isn't worth that," she snapped her fingers, "compared to feeling Barney's arms around me and his cheek against mine." "Oh, Dawes," said Cousin Stickles. Cousin Sarah said, "Oh, Dawes." Aunt Wellington said, "Valency, you need not be indecent." "Why? It surely isn't indecent to like to have your husband put his arm around you. I should think it would be indecent if you didn't." "Why expect decency from her?" inquired Uncle James sarcastically. "She has cut herself off from decency forevermore. She has made her bed. Let her lie on it." "Thanks," said Valency very gratefully. "How you would have enjoyed being Torquemada. Now, I must really be getting back. Mother, may I have those 3 woolen cushions I worked last winter?" "Take them. Take everything," said Mrs. Frederick. "Oh, I don't want everything or much. I don't want my blue castle cluttered. Just the cushions. I'll call for them some day when we motor in." Valency rose and went to the door. There she turned. She was sorrier than ever for them all. They had no blue castle in the purple solitudes of Miss Tavis. "The trouble with you people is that you don't laugh enough," she said. "Dawes, dear," said Cousin Georgiana mournfully, "some day you will discover that blood is thicker than water." "Of course it is. But who wants water to be thick?" parried Valency. "We want water to be thin, sparkling, crystal clear." Cousin Stickles groaned. Valency would not ask any of them to come and see her. She was afraid they would come out of curiosity. But she said, "Do you mind if I drop in and see you once in a while, Mother?" "My house will always be open to you," said Mrs. Frederick with a mournful dignity. "You should never recognize her again," said Uncle James sternly, as the door closed behind Valency. "I cannot quite forget that I am a mother," said Mrs. Frederick. "My poor unfortunate girl." "I dare say the marriage isn't legal," said Uncle James comfortingly. "He has probably been married half a dozen times before, but I am through with her. I have done all I could, Amelia. I think you will admit that. Henceforth," Uncle James was terribly solemn about it, "Valency is to me as one dead." "Mrs. Barney Snaith," said Cousin Georgiana, as if trying it out to see how it would sound. "He has a score of aliases, no doubt," said Uncle Benjamin. "For my part, I believe the man is half Indian. I haven't a doubt they're living in a wigwam. If he has married her under the name of Snaith, and it isn't his real name, Wouldn't that make the marriage null and void? Asked Cousin Stickles hopefully. Uncle James shook his head. No, it is the man who marries, not the name. You know, said Cousin Gladys, who had recovered and returned, but was still shaky. I had a distinct premonition of this at Herbert's silver dinner. I remarked it at the time, when she was defending Snaith. You remember, of course. It came over me like a revelation. I spoke to David when I went home about it. What? Demanded Aunt Wellington of the universe. Has come over Valency. Valency. The universe did not answer, but Uncle James did. Isn't there something coming up of late about secondary personalities cropping out? I don't hold with many of those newfangled notions, but there may be something in this one. It would account for her incomprehensible conduct. Valency is so fond of mushrooms, sighed Cousin Georgiana. I'm afraid she'll get poisoned eating toadstools by mistake living up back in the woods. There are worse things than death, said Uncle James, believing that it was the first time in the world that such statement had been made. Nothing can ever be the same again, sobbed Cousin Stickles. Valency, hurrying along the dusty road back to cool Miss Tavis and her purple island, had forgotten all about them, just as she had forgotten that she might drop dead at any moment if she hurried. End of chapter 27. The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Section 28. Summer passed by. The Sterling clan, with the insignificant exception of Cousin Georgiana, had tacitly agreed to follow Uncle James' example and look upon Valency as one dead. To be sure, Valency had an unquiet, ghostly habit of recurring resurrections when she and Barney clattered through Deerwood and out to the port in that unspeakable car. Valency, bareheaded, with stars in her eyes. Barney, bareheaded, smoking his pipe. But shaved. Always shaved now, if any of them had noticed it. They even had the audacity to go into Uncle Benjamin's store to buy groceries. Twice Uncle Benjamin ignored them. Was not Valency one of the dead, while Snaith had never existed? But the third time he told Barney he was a scoundrel who should be hung for luring an unfortunate, weak-minded girl away from her home and friends. Barney's one straight eyebrow went up. I have made her happy, he said coolly. And she was miserable with her friends, so that's that. Uncle Benjamin stared. It had never occurred to him that women had to be, or ought to be, made happy. You pup, he said. Why be so unoriginal? Queried Barney amiably. Anybody could be a pup. Why not think of something worthy of the Sterlings? Besides, I'm not a pup. I'm really quite a middle-aged dog. 35 if you're interested in knowing. Uncle Benjamin remembered just in time that Valency was dead. He turned his back on Barney. Valency was happy, gloriously and entirely so. She seemed to be living in a wonderful house of life, and every day opened a new mysterious room. It was in a world which had nothing in common with the one she had left behind. A world where time was not, which was young with immortal youth, where there was neither past nor future, but only the present. She surrendered herself utterly to the charm of it. The absolute freedom of it all was unbelievable. They could do exactly as they liked. No Mrs. Grundy, no traditions, no relatives or in-laws. Peace, perfect peace with loved ones far away, as Barney quoted shamelessly. Valency had gone home once and got her cushions, and Cousin Georgiana had given her one of her famous candlewick spreads of most elaborate design. For your spare room bed, dear, she said. But I haven't got any spare room, said Valency. Cousin Georgiana looked horrified. A house without a spare room was monstrous to her. But it's a lovely spread, said Valency with a kiss, and I'm so glad to have it. I'll put it on my own bed. Barney's old patchwork quilt is getting ragged. I don't see how you can be contented to live up back, sighed Cousin Georgiana. It's so out of the world. Contented? Valency laughed. What was the use of trying to explain to Cousin Georgiana? It is, she agreed, most gloriously and entirely out of the world. And you're really happy, dear? Asked Cousin Georgiana wistfully. I really am, said Valency gravely. her eyes dancing. Marriage is such a serious thing, sighed Cousin Georgiana. When it's going to last long, agreed Valency. Cousin Georgiana did not understand this at all, but it worried her, and she lay awake at nights wondering what Valency meant by it. Valency loved her blue castle and was completely satisfied with it. The big living room had 3 windows, all commanding exquisite view of exquisite Miss Davis. The one in the end of the room was an oriel window, which Tom McMurray, Barney explained, had got out of some little old up-back church that had been sold. It faced the west, and when the sunsets flooded it, Valency's whole being knelt in prayer, as if in some great cathedral. The new moons always looked down through it. The lower pine boughs swayed about the top of it, and all through the nights the soft, dim silver of the lake dreamed through it. There was a stone fireplace on the other side. No desecrating gas imitation, but a real fireplace where you could burn real logs. With a big grizzly bearskin on the floor before it, and beside it a hideous red plush sofa of Tom McMurray's regime. But its ugliness was hidden by silver-grey timber wolf skins, and Valency's cushions made it gay and comfortable. In a corner a nice tall lazy old clock ticked. The right kind of a clock, one that did not hurry the hours away, but ticked them off deliberately. It was the jolliest looking old clock, a fat, corpulent clock with a great round man's face painted on it, the hands stretching out of its nose and the hours encircling it like a halo. There was a big glass case of stuffed owls and several deer heads, likewise of Tom McMurray's vintage. Some comfortable old chairs that asked to be sat upon. A squat little chair with a cushion was prospectively Banjo's. If anybody else dared sit on it, Banjo glared him out of it with his topaz-hued, black-ringed eyes. Banjo had an adorable habit of hanging over the back of it, trying to catch his own tail, losing his temper because he couldn't catch it, giving it a fierce bite for spite when he did catch it, yowling malignantly with pain. Barney and Valency laughed at him until they ached. But it was Good Luck they loved. They were both agreed that Good Luck was so lovable that he practically amounted to an obsession. One side of the wall was lined with rough, homemade bookshelves filled with books, and between the 2 side windows hung an old mirror in a faded gilt frame, with fat cupids gambolling in the panel over the glass. A mirror, Valency thought, that must be like the fabled mirror into which Venus had once looked, and which thereafter reflected as beautiful every woman who looked into it. Valency thought she was almost pretty in that mirror, but that may be because she had shingled her hair. This was before the day of bobs, and was regarded as a wild, unheard-of proceedings, unless you had typhoid. When Mrs. Frederick heard of it, she almost decided to erase Valency's name from the family Bible. Barney cut the hair square off at the back of Valency's neck, bringing it down into a short black fringe over her forehead. It gave a meaning and a purpose to her little 3-cornered face that it never had possessed before. Even her nose ceased to irritate her. Her eyes were bright, and her sallow skin had cleared to the hue of creamy ivory. The old family joke had come true. She was really fat at last. Anyway, no longer skinny. Valency might never be beautiful, but she was of the type that looks its best in the woods, elfin, mocking, alluring. Her heart bothered her very little. When an attack threatened, she was generally able to head it off with Dr. Trent's prescription. The only bad one she had was one night when she was temporarily out of medicine, and it was a bad one. For the time being, Valency realized keenly that death was actually waiting to pounce on her any moment. But the rest of the time she did not let herself remember it at all. End of chapter 28.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 29. Valency toiled not, neither did she spin. There was really very little work to do. She cooked their meals on a coal-oil stove, performing all her little domestic rites carefully and exultingly, and they ate out on the veranda that almost overhung the lake. Before them lay Mistawis, like a scene out of some fairy tale of old time, and Barney smiling his twisted, enigmatical smile at her across the table. "What a view old Tom picked out when he built this shack," Barney would say exultantly. Supper was the meal Valancy liked best. The faint laughter of winds was always about them, and the colors of the Mistawis, imperial and spiritual under the changing clouds, were something that cannot be expressed in mere words. Shadows, too, clustering in the pines until a wind shook them out and pursued them over the Mistawis. They lay all day along the shores, threaded by ferns and wild blossoms. They stole around the headlands in the glow of the sunset, until twilight wove them all into one great web of dusk. The cats, with their wise, innocent little faces, would sit on the veranda railing and eat the tidbits Barney flung at them. And how good everything tasted! Valancy, amid all the romance of the Mistawis, never forgot that men had stomachs. Barney paid her no end of compliments on her cooking. "After all," he admitted, "there's something to be said for square meals. I've mostly got along by boiling 2 or 3 dozen eggs hard at once and eating a few when I got hungry, with a slice of bacon once in a while and a jorum of tea." Valancy poured tea out of Barney's little battered old pewter teapot of incredible age. She had not even a set of dishes, only Barney's mismatched chip bits, and a dear big pobby old jug of Robin's egg blue. After the meal was over, they would sit there and talk for hours, or sit and say nothing, in the languages of the world, Barney pulling away at his pipe, Valancy dreaming idly and deliciously, gazing at the far-off hills beyond Mistawis, where the spires of firs came out against the sunset. The moonlight would begin to silver the Mistawis. Bats would begin to swoop darkly against the pale western gold. A little waterfall that came down on the high bank not far away would, by some whim of the wildwood gods, begin to look like a wonderful white woman beckoning through the spicy, fragrant evergreens. And Leander would begin to chuckle diabolically on the mainland shore. How sweet it was to sit there and do nothing in the beautiful silence, with Barney at the other side of the table smoking. There were plenty of other islands in sight, though none of them were near enough to be troublesome as neighbors. There was one little group of islets far off to the west, which they called the Fortunate Isles. At sunrise they looked like a cluster of emeralds, at sunset like a cluster of amethysts. They were too small for houses, but the lights on the larger islands would bloom out all over the lake, and bonfires would be lighted on their shores, streaming up into the wood shadows, and throwing great blood-red ribbons over the waters. Music would drift to them alluringly from boats here and there, or from the veranda of the big house of the millionaire on the biggest island. "Would you like a house like that, Moonlight?" asked Barney once, waving his hand at it. He had taken to calling her Moonlight, and Valancy loved it. "No," said Valancy, who had once dreamed of a mountain castle 10 times the size of the rich man's cottage, and now pitied the poor inhabitants of palaces. "No, it's too elegant. I would have to carry it with me everywhere I went, on my back like a snail. It would own me, possess me, body and soul. I like a house I can love and cuddle and boss, just like ours here. I don't envy Hamilton Gozard, the finest summer residence in Canada. It is magnificent, but it isn't my blue castle." Away down at the far end of the lake they got every night a glimpse of a big continental train rushing through the clearing. Valancy liked to watch its lighted windows flash by and wonder who was on it and what hopes and fears it carried. She also amused herself by picturing Barney and herself going to the dances and dinners in the houses on the islands, but she did not want to go in reality. Once they did go to a masquerade dance in the pavilion at one of the hotels up the lake, and had a glorious evening, but slipped away in their canoe before unmasking time, back to the Blue Castle. "It was lovely, but I don't want to go back again," said Valancy. So many hours a day Barney shut himself in the Bluebeard's chamber. Delancey never saw the inside of it. From the smells that filtered through at times, she concluded he must be conducting chemical experiments or counterfeiting money. Delancey supposed there must be smelly processes in making counterfeit money, but she did not trouble herself about it. She had no desire to peer into the locked chambers of Barney's house of life. His past and his future concerned her not, only this rapturous present. Nothing else mattered. Once he went away and stayed away 2 days and nights. He had asked Delancey if she would be afraid to stay alone, and she had said she would not. He never told her where he had been. She was not afraid to be alone, but she was horribly lonely. The sweetest sound she had ever heard was Lady Jane's clatter through the woods when Barney returned, and then his signal whistle from the shore. She ran down to the landing rock to greet him, to nestle herself into his eager arms. They did seem eager. "Have you missed me, Moonlight?" Barney was whispering. "It seems 100 years since you went away," said Delancey. "I won't leave you again." "You must," protested Delancey, "if you want to. I'd be miserable if I thought you wanted to go and didn't because of me. I want you to feel perfectly free." Barney laughed a little cynically. "There's no such thing as freedom on earth," he said. "Only different kinds of bondages, and comparative bondages. You think you are free now because you've escaped from a peculiarly unbearable kind of bondage. But are you? You love me, that's a bondage." "Who said or wrote that the prison unto which we doom ourselves no prison is?" asked Delancey dreamily, clinging to his arm as they climbed up the rock steps. "Ah, now you have it," said Barney. "That's all the freedom we can hope for, the freedom to choose our prison. But Moonlight—" He stopped at the door of the Blue Castle and looked about him, at the glorious lake, the great shadowy woods, the bonfires, the twinkling lights. "Moonlight, I'm glad to be home again. When I came down through the woods and saw my home lights, mine, gleaming out under the old pines, something I'd never seen before, oh, girl, I was glad, glad." But in spite of Barney's doctrine of bondage, Delancey thought they were splendidly free. It was amazing to be able to sit up half the night and look at the moon if you wanted to be late for meals if you wanted to. She, who had always been rebuked so sharply by her mother and so reproachfully by Cousin Stickles if she were 1 minute late. Dawdle over meals as long as you wanted to. Leave your crusts if you wanted to. Not come home at all for meals if you wanted to. Sit on a sun-warm rock and paddle your bare feet in the hot sand if you wanted to. Just sit and do nothing in the beautiful silence if you wanted to. In short, do any fool thing you wanted to whenever the notion took you. If that wasn't freedom, what was? End of chapter 29.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Section 30. They didn't spend all their days on the island. They spent more than half of them wandering at will through the enchanted Muskoka country. Barney knew the woods as a book, and he taught their lore and craft to Valancy. He could always find trail and haunt of the shy wood people. Valancy learned the different fairy likenesses of the mosses, the charm and exquisiteness of woodland blossoms. She learned to know every bird at sight and mimic its call, though never so perfectly as Barney. She made friends with every kind of tree. She learned to paddle a canoe as well as Barney himself. She liked to be out in the rain, and she never caught cold. Sometimes they took a lunch with them and went berrying, strawberries and blueberries. How pretty blueberries were! The dainty green of the unripe berries, the glossy pinks and scarlets of the half-ripes, the misty blue of the fully matured. And Valancy learned the real flavor of the strawberry in its highest perfection. There was a certain sunlit dell on the banks of Mistawis, along which white birches grew on one side, and on the other still, changeless ranks of young spruces. There were long grasses at the roots of the birches, combed down by the winds and wet with morning dew late into the afternoon. Here they found berries that might have graced the banquets of Lucullus, great ambrosial sweetnesses hanging like rubies to long rosy stalks. They lifted them by the stalk and ate them from it, uncrushed and virgin, tasting each berry by itself with all its wild fragrance and suffered therein. When Valancy carried any of these berries home, that elusive essence escaped, and they became nothing more than the common berries of the marketplace. Very kitchenly good indeed, but not as they would have been, eaten in their birch dell until her fingers were stained as pink as Aurora's eyelids. Or they went after water lilies. Barney knew where to find them, in the creeks and bays of Mistawis. Then the Blue Castle was glorious with them, every receptacle that Valancy could contrive filled with the exquisite things. If not water lilies, then cardinal flowers, fresh and vivid from the swamps of Mistawis, where they burned like ribbons of flame. Sometimes they went trouting on little nameless rivers or hidden brooks on whose banks naiads might have sunned their white, wet limbs. Then all they took with them were some raw potatoes and salt. They roasted the potatoes over a fire, and Barney showed Valancy how to cook the trout by wrapping them in leaves, coating them with mud, and baking them in a bed of hot coals. Never were such delicious meals. Valancy had such an appetite it was no wonder she put flesh on her bones. Or they just prowled and explored through the woods that always seemed to be expecting something wonderful to happen. At least, that was the way Valancy felt about them. Down the next hollow, over the next hill, you would find it. "We don't know where we're going, but isn't it fun to go?" Barney used to say. Once or twice night overtook them, too far from their blue castle to get back, but Barney made a fragrant bed of bracken and fir boughs, and they slept on it dreamlessly, under a ceiling of old spruces with moss hanging from them, while beyond them moonlight and the murmur of pines blended together so that one could hardly tell which was light and which was sound. There were rainy days, of course, when Muskoka was a wet green land, days when showers drifted across Mistawis like pale ghosts of rain, and they never thought of staying in because of it. Days when it rained in right good earnest and they had to stay in. Then Barney shut himself in Bluebeard's chamber, and Valancy read or dreamed on the wolfskins with Good Luck purring beside her and Banjo watching them suspiciously from his own peculiar chair. On Sunday evenings they paddled across to a point of land and walked from there through the woods to the little Free Methodist church. One felt really too happy for Sunday. Valancy had never really liked Sundays before. And always, Sundays and weekdays, she was with Barney. Nothing else really mattered. And what a companion he was. How understanding, how jolly, how Barney-like. That summed it all up. Valancy had taken some of her $200 out of the bank and spent it on pretty clothes. She had a little smoke blue chiffon, which she always put on when they spent the evenings at home. Smoke blue with touches of silver about it. It was after she began wearing it that Barney began calling her Moonlight. Moonlight and blue twilight. That is what you look like in that dress. I like it. It belongs to you. You aren't exactly pretty, but you have some adorable beauty spots. Your eyes, and that little kissable dent just between your collarbones. You have the wrist and ankle of an aristocrat. That little head of yours is beautifully shaped. And when you look backward over your shoulder, you're maddening, especially in twilight or moonlight. An elf maiden, a wood sprite. You belong to the woods. Moonlight, you should never be out of them. In spite of your ancestry, there is something wild and remote and untamed about you. And you have such a nice, sweet, throaty, summery voice. Such a nice voice for lovemaking. Sure, and you've kissed the Blarney Stone, scoffed Valancy. But she tasted these compliments for weeks. She got a pale green bathing suit, too, a garment which would have given her clan their deaths if they had ever seen her in it. Barney taught her how to swim. Sometimes she put her bathing dress on when she got up and didn't take it off until she went to bed, running down to the water for a plunge whenever she felt like it, and sprawling on the sun-warm rocks to dry. She had forgotten all the old humiliating things that used to come up against her in the night, the injustices and the disappointments. It was as if they had all happened to some other person, not to her, Valancy Snaith, who had always been happy. I understand now what it means to be born again, she told Barney. Holmes speaks of grief staining backward through the pages of life, but Valancy found her happiness had stained backward likewise, and flooded with rose color her whole previous drab existence. She found it hard to believe that she had ever been lonely and unhappy and afraid. When death comes, I shall have lived, thought Valancy. I shall have had my hour. And her dust pile. One day Valancy had heaped up the sand in the little island cove in a tremendous cone and stuck a gay little Union Jack on top of it. "What are you celebrating?" Barney wanted to know. "I'm just exorcising an old demon," Valancy told him. End of chapter 30.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 31. Autumn came. Late September with cool nights. They had to forsake the veranda, but they kindled a fire in the big fireplace and sat before it with jest and laughter. They left the doors open, and Banjo and Good Luck came and went at pleasure. Sometimes they sat gravely on the bearskin rug between Barney and Valancy. Sometimes they slunk off into the mystery of the chill night outside. The stars smoldered in the horizon mists through the old oriel. The haunting, persistent croon of the pine trees filled the air. The little waves began to make soft, sobbing splashes on the rocks below them in the rising winds. They needed no light but the firelight that sometimes leaped up and revealed them, sometimes shrouded them in shadow. When the night wind rose higher, Barney would shut the door and light a lamp and read to her poetry and essays and gorgeous dim chronicles of ancient wars. Barney never would read novels. He vowed they bored him. But sometimes she read them herself, curled up on the wolf skins, laughing aloud in peace. For Barney was not one of those aggravating people who could never hear you smiling audibly over something you've read without inquiring placidly, "What's the joke?" October, with a gorgeous pageant of color around Bestowis into which Valancy plunged her soul. Never had she imagined anything so splendid. A great, tinted peace. Blue, wind-winnowed skies. Sunlight sleeping in the glades of that fairyland. Long, dreamy purple days, padding idly in their canoe along shores and up the rivers of crimson and gold. A sleepy, red hunter's moon. Enchanted tempests that stripped the leaves from the trees and heaped them along the shores, flying shadows of clouds. What had all the smug, opulent lands out front to compare with this? November, with uncanny witchery in its changed trees, with murky red sunsets flaming in smoky crimson behind the westering hills, with dear days when the austere woods were beautiful and gracious in a dignified serenity of folded hands and closed eyes, days full of a fine pale sunshine that sifted through the late leafless gold of the juniper trees and glimmered among the gray beeches, lighting up evergreen banks of moss and washing the colonnades of the pines, days with a high-sprung sky of flawless turquoise, days when an exquisite melancholy seemed to hang over the landscape and dream about the lake, but days, too, of the wild blackness of great autumn storms, followed by dank, wet, streaming nights when there was witch laughter in the pines and fitful moans among mainland trees. What cared they? Old Tom had built his roof well, and his chimney drew. Warm fire, books, comfort, safety from storm, our cats on the rug. Moonlight, said Barney, would you be any happier now if you had $1 million? No, nor half so happy. I'd be bored by conventions and obligations then. December, early snows and Orion, the pale fires of the Milky Way. It was really winter now. Wonderful, cold, starry winter. How Valancy had always hated winter. Dull, brief, uneventful days. Long, cold, companionless nights. Cousin Stickles with her back that had to be rubbed continually. Cousin Stickles making weird noises, gargling her throat in the mornings. Cousin Stickles whining over the price of coal. Her mother, probing, questioning, ignoring, endless colds and bronchitis or the dread of it, Redford's liniment and purple pills. But now, she loved winter. Winter was beautiful up back, almost intolerably beautiful. Days of clear brilliance, evenings that were like cups of glamour, the purest vintage of winter's wine, nights with their fire of stars, cold, exquisite winter sunrises, lovely ferns of ice all over the windows of the Blue Castle, moonlight on birches in a silver thaw, ragged shadows on windy evenings, torn, twisted, fantastic shadows, great silences, austere and searching, jeweled, barbaric hills, the sun suddenly breaking through gray clouds over long white Mistawis, icy gray twilights, broken by snow squalls, when their cozy living room, with its goblins of firelight and inscrutable cats, seemed cozier than ever. Every hour brought a new revelation and wonder. Barney ran Lady Jane into Roaring Abel's barn and taught Valency how to snowshoe. Valency, who ought to be laid up with bronchitis, but Valency had not even a cold. Later on in the winter, Barney had a terrible one, and Valency nursed him through it with a dread of pneumonia in her heart. But Valency's colds seemed to have gone where old moons go, which was luck, for she hadn't even Redfern's liniment. She had thoughtfully bought a bottle at the port, and Barney had hurled it into the frozen Mistawis with a scowl. "Bring no more of that devilish stuff here," he'd ordered briefly. It was the first and last time he'd spoken harshly to her. They went for long tramps through the exquisite reticence of winter woods and the silver jungle of frosted trees, and found loveliness everywhere. At times, they seemed to be walking through a spellbound world of crystal and pearl. So white and radiant were clearings and lakes and sky. The air was so crisp and clear that it was half intoxicating. Once they stood in a hesitation of ecstasy at the entrance of a narrow path between ranks of birches. Every twig and spray was outlined in snow. The undergrowth along its sides was a little fairy forest cut out of marble. The shadows cast by the pale sunshine were fine and spiritual. "Come away," said Barney, turning. "We must not commit the desecration of tramping through there." One evening they came upon a snowdrift, far back in an old clearing, which was in the exact likeness of a beautiful woman's profile. Seen too close by, the resemblance was lost, as in the fairy tale of the Castle of St. John. Seen from behind, it was a shapeless oddity. But at just the right distance and angle, the outline was so perfect that when they came suddenly upon it, gleaming out against the dark background of spruce in the glow of winter sunset, they both exclaimed in amazement. There was a low, noble brow, a straight, classic nose, lips and chin, and cheek curve modeled as if some goddess of old time had sat to the sculptor, and a breast of such cold, swelling purity as the very spirit of the winter woods might display. "All the beauty that old Greece and Rome sung, painted tonight," quoted Barney. "And to think, no human eyes save ours have seen or will see it," breathed Valency, who felt at times as if she were living in a book by John Foster. As she looked around her, she recalled some passages she'd marked in the new Foster book Barney had brought her from the port, with an adjuration not to expect him to read or listen to it. "All the timings of winter woods are extremely delicate and elusive," recalled Valency. "When the brief afternoon wanes and the sun just touches the tops of the hills, there seems to be all over the woods an abundance, not of color, but of the spirit of color. There is really nothing but pure white, after all, but one has the impression of fairy-like blendings of rose and violet, opal and heliotrope on the slopes, in the dingles and along the curves of the forest land. You feel sure the tint is there, but when you look at it directly, it's gone. From the corner of your eye, you're aware that it is lurking over yonder, in a spot where there was nothing but pale purity a moment ago. Only just when the sun is setting is there a fleeting moment of real color. Then the redness streams out over the snow, and incarnadines the hills and rivers, and smites the crest of the pines with flame. Just a few minutes of transfiguration and revelation, and it's gone. I wonder if John Foster ever spent a winter in Mistawis, said Valancy. Not likely, scoffed Barney. People who write tosh like that generally write it in a warm house on some smug city street. You are too hard on John Foster, said Valancy severely. No one could have written that little paragraph I read you last night without having seen it first. You know he couldn't. I didn't listen to it, said Barney morosely. You know, I told you I wouldn't. And you've got to listen to it now, persisted Valancy. She made him stand still on his snowshoes while she repeated it. She is a rare artist, this old Mother Nature, who works for the joy of working, and not in any spirit of vain show. Today the fir woods are a symphony of greens and grays, so subtle that you cannot tell where one shade begins to be the other. Gray trunk, green bough, gray-green moss above the white, gray-shadowed floor. Yet the old gypsy doesn't like unrelieved monotones. She must have a dash of color. See it, a broken dead fir bough of a beautiful red-brown swinging among the beards of moss. Good Lord! Do you learn all that fellow's books by heart? Was Barney's disgusted reaction as he strode off. John Foster's books were all that saved my soul alive the past 5 years, averred Valancy. Oh, Barney, look at that exquisite filigree of snow in the furrows of that old elm tree trunk. When they came out to the lake, they changed from snowshoes to skates and skated home. For a wonder, Valancy had learned when she was a little schoolgirl to skate on the pond behind the Deerwood School. She never had any skates of her own, but some of the other girls had lent her theirs, and she seemed to have a natural knack of it. Uncle Benjamin had once promised her a pair of skates for Christmas, but when Christmas came, he'd given her rubbers instead. She'd never skated since she grew up, but the old trick came back quickly, and glorious were the hours she and Barney spent skimming over the white lakes and past the dark islands, where the summer cottages were closed and silent. Tonight they flew down Mistawis before the wind in an exhilaration that crimsoned Valancy's cheeks under her white tarn. And at the end was her dear little house on the island of pines, with a coating of snow on its roof sparkling in the moonlight. Its windows glinted impishly at her in the stray gleams. Looks exactly like a picture book, doesn't it? Said Barney. They had a lovely Christmas. No rush, no scramble. No niggling attempts to make ends meet. No wild effort to remember whether she hadn't given the same kind of present to the same person 2 Christmases before. No mob of last-minute shoppers. No dreary family reunions, where she sat mute and unimportant. No attacks of nerves. They decorated the Blue Castle with pine boughs, and Valancy made delightful little tinsel stars and hung them up amid the greenery. She cooked a dinner to which Barney did full justice, while Good Luck and Banjo picked the bones. A land that can produce a goose like that is an admirable land, vowed Barney. Canada forever. And they drank to the Union Jack a bottle of dandelion wine that Cousin Georgiana had given Valancy, along with the bedspread. One never knows, Cousin Georgiana had said solemnly, when one may need a little stimulant. Barney had asked Valancy what she wanted for a Christmas present. Something frivolous and unnecessary, said Valancy, who had got a pair of galoshes last Christmas and 2 long-sleeved woolen undervests the year before, and so on back. To her delight, Barney gave her a necklace of pearl beads. Valancy had wanted a string of milky pearl beads, like congealed moonshine, all her life, and these were so pretty. All that worried her was that they were really too good. They must have cost a great deal, $15 at least. Could Barney afford that? She didn't know a thing about his finances. She'd refused to let him buy any of her clothes. She had enough for that, she told him, as long as she would need clothes. In a round black jar in the chimney-piece, Barney put money for their household expenses. Always enough. The jar was never empty, though Valancy never caught him replenishing it. He couldn't have much, of course, and that necklace, but Valancy tossed care aside. She would wear it and enjoy it. It was the first pretty thing she had ever had. End of chapter 31. The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery, chapter 32. New Year. The old, shabby, inglorious, outlived calendar came down. The new one went up. January was a month of storms. It snowed for 3 weeks on end. The thermometer went miles below zero and stayed there. But as Barney and Valency pointed out to each other, there were no mosquitoes, and the roar and crackle of their big fire drowned the howls of the north wind. Good Luck and Banjo waxed fat and developed resplendent coats of thick, silky fur. Nip and Tuck had gone. "But they'll come back in spring," promised Barney. There was no monotony. Sometimes they had dramatic little private spats that never even thought of becoming quarrels. Sometimes Roaring Abel dropped in, for an evening or a whole day, with his old tartan cap and his long red beard coated with snow. He generally brought his fiddle and played for them, to the delight of all except Banjo, who would go temporarily insane and retreat under Valency's bed. Sometimes Abel and Barney talked while Valency made candy for them. Sometimes they sat and smoked in silence a la Tennyson and Carlyle until the Blue Castle reeked and Valency fled to the open. Sometimes they played checkers fiercely and silently the whole night through. Sometimes they all ate the russet apples Abel had brought, while the jolly old clock ticked the delightful minutes away. A plate of apples, an open fire, and a jolly good book are a fair substitute for heaven, vowed Barney. Anyone can have the streets of gold. Let's have another whack at Carmen. It was easier now for the Sterlings to believe Valency of the dead. Not even dim rumors of her having been over at the port came to trouble them, though she and Barney used to skate there occasionally to see a movie and eat hot dogs shamelessly at the corner stand afterwards. Presumably, none of the Sterlings ever thought about her, except Cousin Georgiana, who used to lie awake worrying about poor Doss. Did she have enough to eat? Was that dreadful creature good to her? Was she warm enough at nights? Valency was quite warm at nights. She used to wake up and revel silently in the coziness of those winter nights on that little island in the frozen lake. The nights of other winters had been so cold and long. Valency hated to wake up in them and think about the bleakness and emptiness of the day that had passed, and the bleakness and emptiness of the day that would come. Now she almost counted that night lost in which she didn't wake up and lie awake for half an hour just being happy, while Barney's regular breathing went on beside her, and through the open door the smoldering brands in the fireplace winked at her in the gloom. It was very nice to feel a little lucky cat jump up on your bed in the darkness and snuggle down at your feet, purring. But Banjo would be sitting dourly by himself out in front of the fire like a brooding demon. At such moments, Banjo was anything but canny, but Valency loved his uncanniness. The side of the bed had to be right against the window. There was no other place for it in the tiny room. Valency, lying there, could look out of the window through the big pine boughs that actually touched it, away up Mistawis, white and lustrous as a pavement of pearl, or dark and terrible in the storm. Sometimes the pine boughs tapped against the panes with friendly signals. Sometimes she heard the little hissing whisper of snow against them right at her side. Some nights the whole outer world seemed given over to the empery of silence. Then came nights when there would be a majestic sweep of wind in the pines, nights of dear starlight when it whistled freakishly and joyously around the Blue Castle, brooding nights before storm, when it crept along the floor of the lake with a low, wailing cry of brooding and mystery. Valency wasted many perfectly good sleeping hours in these delightful communings, but she could sleep as long in the morning as she wanted to. Nobody cared. Barney cooked his own breakfast of bacon and eggs, and then shut himself up in Bluebird's chamber until supper time. Then they had an evening of reading and talk. They talked about everything in this world, and a good many things in other worlds. They laughed over their own jokes until the Blue Castle re-echoed. You do laugh beautifully Barney told her once. "It makes me want to laugh just to hear you laugh. There's a trick about your laugh, as if there was so much more fun back of it that you wouldn't let out. Did you laugh like that before you came, Miss Dowis, Moonlight?" "I never laughed at all, really. I used to giggle foolishly when I felt I was expected to, but now the laugh just comes." It struck Valency more than once that Barney himself laughed a great deal oftener than he used to, and that his laugh had changed. It had become wholesome. She rarely heard the little cynical note in it now. Could a man laugh like that who had crimes on his conscience? Yet Barney must have done something. Valency had indifferently made up her mind as to what he had done. She concluded that he was a defaulting bank cashier. She'd found in one of Barney's books an old clipping cut from a Montreal paper in which a vanished defaulting cashier was described. The description applied to Barney, as well as to a half-dozen other men Valency knew, and from some casual remarks he'd dropped from time to time, she concluded that he knew Montreal rather well. Valency had it all figured out in the back of her mind. Barney had been in a bank. He was tempted to take some money to speculate, meaning, of course, to put it back. He had got in deeper and deeper, until he found there was nothing for it but flight. It had happened so to scores of men. He had, Valency was absolutely certain, never meant to do wrong. Of course, the name of the man in the clipping was Bernard Craig, but Valency had always thought that Snaith was an alias. Not that it mattered. Valency had only one unhappy night that winter. It came in late March, when most of the snow had gone and Nip and Tuck had returned. Barney had gone off in the afternoon for a long woodland tramp, saying he'd be back by dark if all went well. Soon after he had gone, it had begun to snow. The wind rose, and presently Miss Dowis was in the grip of one of the worst storms of the winter. It tore up the lake and struck at the little house. The dark, angry woods on the mainland scowled at Valency, menace in the toss of their boughs, threats in their windy gloom, terror in the roar of their hearts. The trees on the island crouched in fear. Valency spent the night huddled on the rug before the fire, her face buried in her hands, when she was not vainly peering from the oriel in a futile effort to see through the furious smoke of wind and snow that had once been blue-dimpled Miss Dowis. Where was Barney? Lost on the merciless lakes, sinking exhausted in the drifts of the pathless woods? Valency died 100 deaths that night and paid in full for all the happiness of her blue castle. When morning came, the storm broke and cleared. The sun shone gloriously over Miss Dowis, and at noon Barney came home. Valency saw him from the oriel as he came around a wooded point, slender and black against the glistening white world. She did not run to meet him. Something happened to her knees, and she dropped down on Banjo's chair. Luckily, Banjo got out from under in time, his whiskers bristling with indignation. Barney found her there, her head buried in her hands. "Barney, I thought you were dead," she whispered. Barney hooted. "After 2 years of the Klondike, did you think a baby storm like this could get me? I spent the night in that old lumber shanty over by Muskoka. Bit cold, but snug enough. Little goose, your eyes look like burnt holes in a blanket. Did you sit up here all night worrying over an old woodsman like me?" "Yes," said Valency. "I couldn't help it. The storm seemed so wild. Anybody might have been lost in it. When I saw you come round the point, something happened to me. I don't know what. It was as if I had died and come back to life. I can't describe it any other way." End of chapter 32.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Spring. Miss Dowis, black and sullen for a week or two, then flaming in sapphire and turquoise, lilac and rose again, laughing through the oriel, caressing its amethyst islands, rippling under winds soft as silk. Frogs, little green wizards of swamp and pool, singing everywhere in the long twilights and long into the nights. islands fairy-like in a green haze, the evanescent beauty of wild young trees in early leaf, frost-like loveliness of the new foliage of juniper trees, the woods putting on a fashion of spring flowers, dainty, spiritual things akin to the soul of the wilderness, red mist on the maples, willows decked out with glossy silver pussies, all the forgotten violets of Mistawis blooming again, lure of April moons. Think how many thousands of springs have been here on Mistawis, and all of them beautiful, said Valancy. Oh, Barney, look at that wild plum. I will. I must quote from John Foster. There's a passage in one of his books. I've reread it 100 times. He must have written it before a tree just like that. Behold the young wild plum tree, which has adorned herself after immemorial fashion in a wedding veil of fine lace. The fingers of wood pixies must have woven it, for nothing like it ever came from an earthly loom. I vow the tree is conscious of its loveliness. It is bridling before our very eyes, as if its beauty were not the most ephemeral thing in the woods, as it is the rarest and most exceeding, for today it is and tomorrow it is not. Every south wind purring through the boughs will winnow away in a shower of slender petals. But what matter? Today it is queen of the wild places, and it is always today in the woods. I'm sure you feel much better since you've got that out of your system, said Barney heartlessly. Here's a patch of dandelions, said Valancy, unsubdued. Dandelions shouldn't grow in the woods, though. They haven't any sense of the fitness of things at all. They are too cheerful and self-satisfied. They haven't any of the mystery and reserve of the real wood flowers. In short, they've no secrets, said Barney. But wait a bit. The woods will have their own way, even with those obvious dandelions. In a little while, all that obtrusive yellowness and complacency will be gone, and we'll find here misty, phantom-like globes hovering over those long grasses in full harmony with the traditions of the forest. That sounds John Fosterish, teased Valancy. What have I done that deserved a slam like that? Complained Barney. One of the earliest signs of spring was the renaissance of Lady Jane. Barney put her on roads that no other car would look at, and they went through Deerwood in mud to the axles. They passed several Sterlings, who groaned and reflected that now spring was come and they would encounter that shameless pair everywhere. Valancy, prowling about Deerwood shops, met Uncle Benjamin on the street, but he did not realize until he had gone 2 blocks further on that the girl in the scarlet-collared blanket coat, with cheeks reddened in the sharp April air, and the fringe of black hair over laughing, slanted eyes, was Valancy. When he did realize it, Uncle Benjamin was indignant. What business had Valancy to look like a young girl? The way of the transgressor was hard. Had to be. Scriptural and proper. Yet Valancy's path couldn't be hard. She wouldn't look like that if it were. There was something wrong. It was almost enough to make a man turn modernist. Barney and Valancy clanged on to the port, so that it was dark when they went through Deerwood again. At her old home, Valancy, seized with a sudden impulse, got out, opened the little gate, and tiptoed around to the sitting-room window. There sat her mother and Cousin Stickles, drearily, grimly knitting, baffling and inhuman as ever. If they had looked the least bit lonesome, Valancy would have gone in. But they did not. Valancy would not disturb them for worlds. End of chapter 33.